request two members to come. We're going to go ahead and get started, and if Board Member Chen arrives, you'll see her
Recording
arriving.
in progress.
Thank you. Good morning. Welcome to the Palo Alto Architectural Review Board meeting of Thursday, October 3rd, 2024. We are here in Palo Alto Council Chambers. It is 10 a.m. and Board Member Chen has just arrived as well. So just in time for the roll call.
Chair Rosenberg,
Present.
Vice Chair Chen,
Present. Perfect timing.
Board Member Adcock,
Present.
Board Member Balte,
Present.
Board Member Hirsch.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Great, thank you very much. At this time, we would like to open the floor for public comment. This is a time for any of the members of the public who wish to speak in an item that is not on the agenda. So any sort of extra items that, again, are not on the agenda, you would have 3 minutes to speak. Veronica, do we have any public speaker cards or any raised hands?
I have no request to speak.
Okay, great. Then we'll move on to agenda changes, additions, and deletions.
None.
None? Great. And then we will go to city official reports. And I believe this is now in Claire's hands or Jennifer's hands?
Yes.
This is in Claire's hands.
I'll be
Great.
filling in
you,
for
Claire.
Jody today, who's on vacation. Claire Raybold, interim manager, current planning. For tentative future agenda, I did have a small mix-up I missed a meeting date. So October 17th is the date that we plan to bring forward 762 San Antonio Road for an early hearing for consideration and early feedback. And then we will be bringing forward 4075 El Camino Way, planned community rezoning for zoning amendment. And this will be the second hearing for that project, asking for a recommendation. On November 7th, we intend to bring forward 824 San Antonio Road. This will also be a second hearing for a formal recommendation on the project. We do anticipate that we'll have a full agenda, but we are still resolving some of the items that are going to be on that November 21st agenda. As far as new projects that came forth, there were, there was a, there were no new projects actually that came forth that were listed. We did have an application, I think at the time of this noticing, it was not in yet, but there is a new proposal at 3050 Fabian Way for girls middle school. And it's a proposal to modify the existing building. So, oh, sorry, 3950. Sorry, it was listed in here. And that will be brought forth. We intend to do an early hearing this year for that project. I do want to introduce you as well to Stephen Switzer. Stephen will be taking over as the liaison to the Architectural Review Board starting at the next hearing. And so I just wanted to introduce him to you guys.
Welcome, Stephen. Excited to be working with you. On this note, just really quickly, Claire, we have, under Board Member Balte's chair, we did a lot of the ad hoc meetings ahead of time to just sort of review projects as they were about to come in for compliance, making sure that the sets were complete, things like that. I'm looking at 824 San Antonio specifically, and it seems to be a reasonably large project, and we do not have an ad hoc assigned for it. So I'm thinking because we have plenty of time before November 7th, I would like to get 2 members of the board to just sort of review that set for compliance and just making sure that we've got what we need and allowing the applicant to have enough time to respond accordingly if needed, if something is sort of missing.
That's certainly fine. It has come before the whole board already and received comments from the board.
So it is the second hearing.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, no, that's fair enough. We'll skip it then. Okay. And then the 670, 762 San Antonio and the 4075 El Camino, those are both on October 17th. And then we do not have anybody scheduled for November 21st yet. Is that correct?
Not listed, yeah.
Okay. And November 21st, is that the day before, that's Thanksgiving?
It will be the week before.
The week before
Yeah.
Thanksgiving. Thank you very much. And then the week of Thanksgiving, we don't have anything scheduled anyway, so.
Correct, yeah.
Thank you very much. Beautiful. Okay, thank you. Making sure I got my ducks in a row. Okay, does anyone at the board have any questions about the agenda or any comments?
Actually, if I may comment here, the
Please.
3950 Fabian Way is actually one of my office's projects. So I will be recusing myself from that review. And we're hoping to have it for review sometime before the end of this year.
Great, thank you. We expect a very complete package.
No pressure, right?
And for the public's understanding, when we've got any type of potential conflict of interest, board members may recuse themselves from a project and just they do not vote on it. So the board member may either step out into the back room and wait over there, or they may just not attend the hearing if that's the only one that's on the agenda for that day. But for the most part, we just ask them to step out into one of the back rooms and sit out on the presentation itself. So we'll probably see you that morning anyway, just not for that portion of the project. So.
And through the chair, we will be sending an email prior to that meeting just to
Perfect.
confirm that we will have a quorum to make sure that nobody else is going to need to miss that meeting.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Okay, with that, I'd like to close city official reports and we will move into our study session. This is the only agendized item for the day. It's agenda item number 2, study session to review potential amendments to the regulations for the Housing Incentive Program, also known as HIP, in Title 18 zoning ordinance of the Palo Alto Municipal Code to implement program 3.4 of the adopted 2023 to 2031 housing element. I am going to ask for disclosures in terms of, there's no site to visit or anything like that, but if there is any sort of disclosures that anyone on the board needs to make, now would be the time to do so. So I have nothing to disclose.
I will disclose that I'm passionately interested in this and have done everything I can over the past few years to push for many of these changes. So I'm quite biased.
Okay, we'll take it.
And biased in favor of the city's
That means you
improving
have to-
housing in
You
town.
have to get in the back room.
Yeah, you've already made your judgment, Peter.
I fully intend to not recuse myself. Thank you.
David, did you have
Yes,
anything?
I would disclose the same actual opinion about this presentation here.
Excellent. Thank you, guys.
No disclosure.
I'm just on the record.
No disclosure. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. All right. And excuse me, with that, presentation will be given by Jean Eisberg.
Yes,
like to-
Jean Eisberg.
Take it away.
Sure. Good morning, Chair and members of the board. I'm Jean Eisberg with Lexington Planning. I'm joined here by Ryan Call, who's an architect with Urban Field. Let me go ahead and share my screen. We'll try to go through the presentation at a bit of a clip. It is a little long, and then we have a lot of time for your discussion and questions and answers. So we are talking about the Housing Incentive Program. This is one of the programs that the recently certified housing element seeks to implement. And so we're going to review some draft findings of a physical feasibility analysis, and then very briefly a financial feasibility analysis of potential changes to the Housing Incentive Program, or the HIP as we call it. And then looking for your feedback that we will then convey to the Planning Commission as they're considering changes in an ordinance. So just to take a look at the bigger picture context, there's a couple density bonus programs that developers have that they can use in the city. One is the HIP, which is the city's local program, and then we have state density bonus law at the state level. So a couple features of these programs: the housing incentive program applies to market rate projects in the city. They're subject to the city's inclusionary requirement, and this allows relaxed development standards in exchange for going through architectural review by the ARB. State density bonus law also allows modified standards in exchange for providing a portion of the project on site as below market rate units or senior housing units. The HIP was enacted almost 6 years ago as an alternative to state density bonus law. So you can't use both. You have to choose one or another as a developer. It again required architectural review at the time. It provided a way to maintain base density levels. So rather than doing a citywide upzoning, let's say, it provided this option for increased density at the existing base levels at that time. It only applied to certain commercial zones. So mostly the corridors didn't apply to any residential zones at the time. No other eligibility requirements. So in these 5, almost 6 years now that this has been in effect, it's only been used a couple times. And so the housing element calls for some changes to try to encourage more use of the HIP. So I've broken this into four bullets here. The first 3 are very specific in the housing element. So the housing element says we want to streamline the process. And so this is if a project meets objective standards, rather than going through architectural review, subject to up to 3 meetings with the ARB, this would be 1 study session or 1 administrative review by the ARB if a project also meets objective standards. Also removes the planning director discretion around defining applicable standards, so making that determination if a project can go up to X FAR. Second, the program in the housing element calls for modifications to the retail requirements. So these are specific changes to the city's retail preservation ordinance. Third, to expand the applicability. So right now, again, only applies to commercial zones. This would add the multifamily residential zone, the RM zones, and the ROLM GM focus area on the eastern side of the city as applicable places where a developer could use the HIP. The fourth one is the one that's the most unspecified in the housing element because it required more research. The housing element program 3.4 says modify zoning standards, excuse me, including FAR, height and parking and other development standards to increase housing production. Doesn't say by how much or how to do that. And so that's why the housing element called for a study to look into that further. This map is just showing in sort of black hatching where the HIP currently applies or as sites can be eligible and where it would apply going forward, adding the housing opportunity sites in blue, adding the purple sites, which are either RM zoned sites or the ROLM GM focus area over here. So just by comparison, a little refresh on state density bonus law. This allows for density bonus in exchange for on-site affordable housing or senior housing. It's different than the HIP in that it allows unlimited waivers from development standards that would physically preclude the construction of those housing units. There have been a number of recent changes to this particular state law, which increases the amount of density a project can get. And so as a result, if we're comparing the HIP and state density bonus law, things have changed a bit, why you might use one or another. This chart is showing, the idea here is some of the benefits, the relative benefits between the two options that a developer has. The green is showing why state density bonus law has some greater benefits and why a developer might choose it. The HIP can actually allow more density depending on the district. Many developers would prefer to do an inclusionary housing payment in lieu fee rather than putting the units on site. So those are a couple of the main benefits of using the HIP. On the other hand, under state law, there's an unlimited number of waivers from objective standards that would physically preclude the housing units. And so that's a huge advantage from the perspective of a developer when they're approaching a project. Also slightly better parking flexibility. In terms of process, one of the main reasons why the HIP was originally enacted was a way to maintain more predictable design controls. So to have architecture review. Now, in the last 5-6 years, things have changed. Now the city has objective standards. There's been a number of streamlining bills at the state level. And so process has really changed both in Palo Alto and at the state level. So in order for the HIP to be used, it does need to be at least as good as or better of an incentive compared to state law. So how do we figure out what the right set of standards are and how do we make sure that it is a real incentive? Even in the absence of architecture review, the ARB review still provides an opportunity between objective standards and the conversation that architects and developers are having with you to provide input. It still provides an opportunity for public comment at the board. And so that's why the housing incentive program is still a key part of the housing element and part of the city's code going forward. So working with Ryan and his team and Kaiser Marston Associates, we looked at the feasibility of some models of the city's existing standards and of potential changes to those standards. So first, looking at the existing zoning standards, the architects developed these physical feasibility models. What can actually be built based on the current standards? And then Kaiser Marston took that and said, okay, is that model that's being developed on those standards, is that actually financially feasible? Would a developer build such a project? And then we sort of iterated around potential changes to standards to ensure that these potential prototypes would be financially feasible. And so now we're working with you and with the Planning Commission and then ultimately the council on considering zoning modifications. We looked at a number of sites throughout the city. These are mostly housing element opportunity sites, so actually sites that could develop in this next cycle. I would say that the sites are on the smaller side. So in some ways, you could see this as a more conservative estimate. It is easier to build, typically to build on larger sites, but we really wanted to model interior lots, corner lots, some lots with alleys, but I will say they are mostly smaller and that has certain challenges that come with it. So I'm going to hand it off to Ryan to introduce some of this analysis.
So my name is Ryan Call with Urban Field Studio. My background, I worked in commercial mixed-use architecture for 20 years at ELS Architects in Berkeley. My focus is mostly in planning and the master planning and entitlements phase of projects. So what we did to really figure this out is we simply looked at the existing rules and figured out what was the physical box or volume of square footage that we could actually use for residential development. And we often found that the open space and FAR requirements and parking requirements, by the time we implemented all of those controls, we had very little room for actual residential space for the units. other requirements such as open space, private open space per unit, and those factors also started to eat away, leaving us with a pretty limited palette of options, mostly focused on townhomes and a smaller unit count. And there was some interest in how do we actually make an apartment, workforce housing more feasible under these for these small sites and development opportunities. Next slide. So I was jumping ahead a little bit here. It was very difficult to actually pull off apartment prototypes based on, oftentimes the open space requirements were required to be at grade, which meant your parking opportunity diminished substantially. And then the open space requirements per unit combined with the parking, you started to see a lot of square footage being built that didn't necessarily return revenue, which meant that you had very small residential units that were heavily impacted by these other requirements, and it just wasn't a big enough revenue churn to redevelop the sites. Next slide.
So next we had Kaiser Marston look at these models and prepare pro formas to analyze whether, based on their analysis of the city's existing rents for sale, construction costs, all of those numbers, whether someone would actually build this project. So they put in all of those inputs, hard costs, soft costs, and then made that determination if the project value exceeded the cost the developer would have to put in, that the project be likely to develop, versus if the project value was less than all of those costs, then the developer would be unlikely to build such a project and overcome the costs, overcome the revenues based on whatever is currently on the site. And so based on that initial analysis of the city's current zoning standards, and again, these are current standards as of before the changes that were made in January to the housing opportunity sites. So first, as Ryan indicated, the physical models were really producing townhomes across the board in most of these districts that we tested. And the response from Kaiser Marston was that those current standards at those typologies would be unlikely to develop based on those standards.
Jeannie, you want me to take this slide? Yeah, the zoning changes to enhance feasibility. As I mentioned before, we wanted to create a better alignment between what a developer with looser restraints would actually build, which has a lot more to do with the building code and what's allowed in the building code, and looking at how things such as the open space or step back requirements, where you get misalignment of upper level units and lower level units, these various elements start to impact the feasibility and attractiveness of the HIP versus going through the state density bonus laws. So in a lot of cases, it was, a typical podium building really wants to be either 4 or 5 stories above the podium. Can we increase building height to get that alignment so that the developer is getting some efficiency there? The daylight plane often started quite low, which made it very difficult to at least get 2 stories in before you start having to step the building back. And we need, a lot of times that podium level is essential for parking and elements. The reduced setbacks on the rear and the side were important to, again, fill out the podium so we could maximize the residential parking. And then same thing with increased site coverage. Having the grade level requirements for open space, again, left us with pretty much an unusable podium. The retail requirements also oftentimes necessitated underground parking, which is extremely expensive and difficult to pencil, especially with a lot of reduced demand for retail space. So in one instance in the downtown, we were looking at preserving upper level retail space, or basically creating 2-level retail space with underground parking to serve it, and then adding, about 6 townhomes. And there was just no reason to tear down a retail building and replace it with a product that expensive. Jeannie, next slide. So this is an example where we looked at the existing zoning where it produced, 4 apartments over on the left. On the right, we took a prototype. Well, it's actually a built product that's in Albany, where it's a small lot redevelopment, and they were able to produce narrow tandem park townhomes. And we were looking at scenarios that were somewhat aggressive, so that we could create recommendations that would allow substantial housing production in order to overcome kind of the steep financial challenge of redeveloping a site where you have a very expensive piece of land and home on that. So in this product here, we went with narrow tandem townhomes, and we were able to produce 7 apartments versus the 4, and they had greater square footage for those. Next slide, Jean. So the modified RM30 zoning versus the original, the front setback at 20 feet. And if you're looking at a 5,000 square foot lot, that puts most of the lot out of use. The side setback, and if it's a corner lot, also substantial impact. So trying to get those units built closer to the street helps, again, create a feasible layout of units. Looking at the building height, a lot of times to get townhomes to pencil, having 40 feet, which allows you a parking level plus 3 living levels, is important. And then the daylight plane, so we're not creating too many irregular levels and roof forms, reducing or raising that up a little bit before you start the daylight plane to 16 foot and 45 degrees. Again, we're trying to create a residential product that is more attractive than going with the state law. And, at the same time, allows your team to have controls. So, and FAR was a critical component. A lot of times, Jeannie and I just ran out of square footage to put on these properties. So we would end up with a building envelope that was unfulfilled because we had run out of allowable square footage to build.
Okay, thank you. So when we took the potentially modified HIP standards, had KMA test those, did a little back and forth iterating on those, and we'll show you another example that shows us some apartments, but we were able to get more of an apartment typology out of some of these zones, and then we're able to achieve financial feasibility with these height, FAR, and other changes to development standards. We'll have Ryan run through one more apartment example.
Well, this one we talked about a little bit before, and you'll notice that the existing CN zoning in the middle shows a ramp going underground to parking. The retail requirement out on El Camino Real was in an area that did not have a robust, retail environment. So the rents that would come out of that square footage were lower. In addition to that, you also have to provide the mechanical servicing, and it wipes out, quite a few residential units. So we looked at revising to make this more attractive to development. If you look at the example on the right, we went with a smaller average apartment size, and we went with live-work units. And then probably the biggest element that helped us out here was moving the open space requirement to the podium level and reducing it so that we could take full advantage of the grade level site for stacked mechanical parking. And, this one here, honestly, another 20 feet would be great. So we could have a 5-level podium, 5 levels of type 3 over the podium. But we're also trying to balance the city's desire for a human scale to the architecture and different elements. So this is where basically working with the 50-foot height limit, we looked at ways to maximize residential production in a more prototypical way for this type of construction. And so our resulting product produced 35. I think the other production was 12. And so we're trying to, again, increase the incentive. I think the big one to pay attention to really was the 5-foot interior and rear setback allowed us to create that podium that had circulation for the car movement, room for the stacked parking, and then also room for grade level apartment, live work apartments, proper depth for those so that the street was active and not simply a parking garage. So having that setback flexibility really helped us out there. The daylight plane really helped us get more of a building footprint. There was some terracing at the upper levels, but we were able to increase our residential footprint and get better alignment from level to level with the unit types. And then the 35% moving the open space to the podium level, again, allowed us to maximize that podium footprint. So we're looking at a reduced parking ratio, which brought our unit count down. Brought our parking count down. And then looking at the 0 requirement for the retail, I think also helps with the feasibility of that.
So a number of changes have already gone into effect. In January of this year, the council adopted a rezoning ordinance that modified the zoning for housing element opportunity sites and created this focus area in El Camino. So there's already been some changes, and for the purposes of state density bonus law, that does reset where that base density starts. So that's sort of another reason why we want to be comparing what you can do under state density bonus law versus the HIP. There's always more and more opportunities for reducing parking requirements through state law, state density bonus law, and AB 2097. And so the changes that we're considering to both try to achieve improved feasibility, also consider the adjacencies and compatibilities with existing development. So in general, for the HIP, the changes we're talking about that we want to discuss with you are increasing FAR, depending on the districts, between 1.4 and 2.25. Increasing building heights, typically it's 10 to 20 feet. It really ranges more like 5 to 23 feet, but generally it's a story or two. As Ryan showed in the one example, revising the daylight plane to just have that initial height start higher and then keep the angle the same, but just to allow more height, particularly at the podium and second level. Reduce parking to match state law standards. That's the state density bonus law standards. Increasing maximum site coverage, which sometimes is 50 or 60%. Reducing setbacks, in particular the front and street side setbacks. We'll talk a little bit more about the rear and interior lot. And then revising the retail preservation ordinance and its applicability. So trying to rebalance and have more incentive go towards why someone might choose the local HIP program. And that's both because of these density increases. We're still not offering unlimited waivers, and that's really on purpose. The idea is to have this menu of standards that allows the community, the ARB, decision makers to have more predictability about what you can expect from a project rather than the unlimited waiver scenario under state law. Now that said, that's why there needs to be other parts of the HIP that are attractive to make sure that a developer would choose it. But again, you sort of see more green on the right side of the screen now that we're trying to shift that balance. So we met with the Planning Commission last week. They were generally supportive of the HIP modifications and had some questions and concerns that I've bulleted here. So second bullet about residential density. In general, we suggested eliminating residential density or increasing it substantially, but really just eliminating it. It's currently not generally regulated in the commercial zones, but is regulated in the multifamily zones. A concern that the Planning Commission had was a desire to continue to encourage family housing, 3+ bedroom units, and a potential consequence that eliminating residential density, will you end up with a bunch of micro units or buildings with a lot of studios. Third bullet, they were not supportive of making additional parking reductions beyond matching state density bonus law requirements. Fourth, there was a desire to retain retail requirements on certain portions of South El Camino Real. So what the housing element talks about and what staff have been talking about, there's these South El Camino Real design guidelines. They're about 20 years old, but still on the books. And they have this idea about sort of nodes of development on South El Camino, and that those would be the areas. And they're a little bit, they're circles on a map in that set of design guidelines, but to codify that and require retail in those areas, but not outside of those areas. So it could be, you could do retail, but it wouldn't be required. Fourth, this was probably the biggest topic of conversation, was around shared property lines. So I think they were more supportive of reductions in the setback on the front property line, at the street side property line, more concerned about reducing setbacks at the rear property line, at interior property lines, particularly next to lower density residential. So some of the slides that Ryan showed, you saw we've got some places there are 20-foot front setbacks where we reduce them to 10. There are places that have 15-foot rear yards, we reduce to 5 or to 10. So that's something we know we have to look at, and we're looking for your guidance on. And the last piece was really the Planning Commission was looking for guidance. Unlike the ARB, they don't look at development standards necessarily on a day-to-day basis. So looking to staff and looking to the ARB for your feedback on some of these specific changes. We do have a few slides which we can come back to that show some examples of what these FARs and densities look like in terms of recently developed projects. And so I'll show them briefly here. If you want to take a look at them again, we can come back to them. But these are pulled from projects that were identified in the housing element. They do all tend to exceed their zoning district's standards for various reasons. Local, workforce housing overlays or state density bonus law, but we can come back to those if you want to take a look at those. So for the discussion today, we've really developed this package of standards. As you know, these development standards all work together. We can push and pull, and there are trade-offs between raising height, increasing lot coverage. But we've sort of designed this as a package. And we heard the sensitivities that the Planning Commission's had, and looking for your feedback on how we can continue to adjust some of these knobs to come up with an envelope that works for the city. So building heights, FAR, this idea of eliminating residential density, reducing setbacks, particularly the front and street side setback, increasing maximum lot coverage, modifying daylight plane, which as Ryan indicated is generally about increasing that initial height, flexibility in how open space is provided, particularly bringing it up off of the ground floor and onto the courtyard or rooftop, and then reducing parking beyond state density bonus law, which I indicated the Planning Commission was less supportive of. So that concludes our presentation, and we look forward to your questions and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you both very much for a very thorough presentation. That was extremely helpful. I would like to open the meeting for questions or comment. Let's stick to questions first. So if anyone has any questions of Ms. Iceberg or Mr. Call, now would be the time. And I'm sort of looking to my right here because we have the two more passionate board members. Oh, public comment. Thank you, Peter. My apologies. We do have time we should be doing public comment first. I apologize. We will open the floor for public comment. Each speaker has 3 minutes to speak. Please state and spell your name for the record, and Veronica will call you up if you're in chambers, or we'll look for raised hands on Zoom. Thank you for that.
Yes, I have 2 speaker cards. First is from Stephen Levy.
Good morning. You will have 3 minutes.
Good morning. My name is Stephen Levy, Stephen with a PH. I share the excitement of the 2 gentlemen who expressed their excitement that we finally gotten to this place. I commend and thank both the staff and Jean and Ryan for finally publicly, officially recognizing that financial feasibility is critical if we want applicants to bring projects forward. I have two simple takeaways. That financial feasibility is important, and that currently we need, as the consultants have said, to make changes, at least on the prototype small projects that they looked at. Probably we all could have figured that out since only 2 applicants have submitted HIP proposals in, 5 years. There's a lot of changes. I hope you move this forward quickly with your comments. I read a lot of things from the PTC that I suspect, when modeled, will push the financial feasibility back from a green arrow to unlikely. So I hope when the ARB and the PTC make their recommendations that the consultants are able to redo the analysis. I don't know exactly what's needed, but I do know as an economist and longtime resident that if it's not feasible, it won't come forward. I have 3 requests. One, that you ask the consultants to model the large apartment projects that are in the housing element, in the focus area, in the GM ROLM area that Mr. Price and I hoped would have been at Encina, but are not, to make sure that the focus area and GMRLM changes make projects feasible. 2, I didn't understand how broadly the consultants are recommending the HIP be modified, but I would go for large modifications, particularly in the North Cal Ave and downtown. As Jonathan has said, and he is correct, we will get projects that are not in the housing element sites. Let's get those incentives. And finally, though justifiable or not, time delay is important. Please have the consultants measure the additional cost of a year of delay. It could be justified, but housing costs have been increasing. So those are my 3 asks, and thank you so much for getting us to this point.
Thank you, Mr. Levy. Next up.
Next is Amy Ashton.
Morning.
Good morning. I'm Amy Ashton, Executive Director of Palo Alto Forward. Thank you, staff, for a thorough fiscal analysis. I'm embarrassed at how much I enjoyed reading that. It's hugely helpful as we make decisions on our development standards. Palo Alto Forward submitted a letter supporting the most robust changes to the zoning ordinance for HIP. These changes are essential to get the projects we want and need to meet our housing element commitment. The fiscal analysis is very clear about this. I heard your comments on 70 Encina and the Summerhill Townhome project. I listened to way too many public hearings. We need robust changes to get the larger multifamily projects that you all want to advocate for, that you see these townhome projects. That's not what we need to meet our commitment. That's not what we need to house the people who want housing here in Palo Alto. Let's not forget, this is meant to be a housing incentive program. If it's not aggressive enough, developers will use state density law, and we won't get the projects we want. And importantly, we won't get the benefit of your architectural review and analysis. We need to be aggressive here. Why not extend HIP to more parcels? Why not implement parking minimums, or I'm sorry, why not eliminate parking minimums for the HIP housing program? Mountain View is eliminating parking minimums for all housing projects in its borders. Why not go a bit higher and allow more FAR to create flexibility and allow creativity? 1.4 is still an exceptionally low FAR in some of these areas. In closing, I'd just like to say, go big or go home. This is so important that half measures aren't going to cut it. So please be aggressive. Make this program something special that developers will implement. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Are there other speakers?
Yes, one on Zoom from Manuel.
Good morning. Please state and spell your name for the record, and you'll have 3 minutes.
Hi, yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Manuel, last name Salazar, Salazar. Great. So good morning, members of the Palo Alto Architectural Review Board. My name is, well, I just said it, Manuel Salazar, and I am speaking to you on behalf of SPA, specifically to express our support for the proposed amendments to Palo Alto's Housing Incentive Program, or HIP. So we appreciate the city's ongoing efforts to make the HIP more responsive to the current constraints faced by residential developers in Palo Alto. These proposed changes acknowledge the realities developers are facing, both from local land use decisions as well as broader market forces impacting development throughout the region. We also appreciate that this updated policy complements rather than replaces the state density bonus law. By offering an alternative pathway for developers, the HIP creates flexibility for affordable housing projects while meeting local and state housing goals. Some notable recent, proposed amendments to the HIP we'd like to highlight are the density bonuses and parking reductions, the higher affordability requirements than the state density bonus, as well as the flexibility allowances like parking reductions and increased density that allow innovative and site-specific solutions. While we support the proposed amendments to the HIP, we urge the council to carefully monitor how this program is implemented alongside the state density bonus law. Clear guidance will be crucial to help developers understand the differences between the two programs and to ensure that they use them effectively without delays. We appreciate the city's efforts in refining the housing incentive program. The proposed changes offer a practical approach to addressing housing needs, and we look forward to continued collaboration in increasing affordable housing production in the city of Palo Alto. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Those are all our speakers.
Great. Thank you to the public for all the public comments. We will now close the meeting for this portion of public commentary. And we will now turn it over to the board for questions and comments of staff. Again, I would like to start off with board members Balte and Hirsch, who have expressed during disclosures their immense support for this. So I'd like to give you guys the floor first.
Well, with all respect, Chair, I wonder if we shouldn't just jump into a discussion on this. I have loads of questions that I think would sidetrack us. For example, how are waivers allowed to be, what determines if it's precluding increase in density? There's a lot of variability we see in that, but that's not going to get us closer to the recommendations they're looking for. But as I've listened to this and checked it off, I think I wrote down 4 overall categories, and I'd suggest we just jump into those. One would be the FAR, another would be the height limitations, a third would be the question of parking, and to me, I made a note about landscaping. But if we were to just identify which pieces of this we think we can productively contribute towards, that would be helpful.
Fabulous. No, I think that's a great idea. And also, Ms. Iceberg, there was a presentation that had the comments from PTC. It was a list of, I believe, 5 items. Is there a way that we could pull that back up on the screen?
That's where I pulled this up from.
Okay, but
and then to my colleagues, I would suggest that as tempting as it is to get involved in where the HIP zones apply throughout town, I made red marks all over that map myself. It's not our purview. We'd love to opine about it, but it's not going to help the process forward. The same thing applies to the retail preservation stuff. Again, I have loads of opinions about that, but that's not the question we're being asked.
I believe that was the 5th point.
Yeah.
About the notes and where on South El Camino in particular, where the retail is required. If I'm in agreement with those 4 items that we want to discuss. I just have a clarification on these nodes, like how is that defined? Is it like street intersection and so much distance? Like I think it was right. Yeah, 4th point here, retail preservation requirements on South El Camino Real. I'm not quite clear on how that's even defined to try to maintain that requirement.
Currently, retail is required, I believe.
Right, but it sounds like in particular nodes as trying to maintain it. So I just want to understand what PTC's recommendation on that is.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That was based on a concern about whether those nodes are clearly enough defined in the South El Camino Real design guidelines. And so they were looking to have some additional information to make sure that those really were the correct locations. There was additional discussion by the PTC about whether those lined up with areas that generally have vacancies or office or kind of really looking back at that, since those design guidelines were adopted back in 2002. So that's a little more context for why that was one of the points that came out of their discussion, that they were interested in thinking about whether that was going to be the correct locations for retaining the commercial.
Okay, and one more question regarding the retail preservation. On packet page 34, the retail preservation requirement revisions, the last item, bullet point is clarify the retail preservation replacement is allowed on 2 floors. So for staff, could you please clarify, currently it is only allowed on the ground floor, or mezzanine level is allowed, or what is the current requirement for that?
We do allow it on 2 floors right now, but I think generally it's encouraged to be on the ground floor.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess back to Peter's proposed list. I do think this is a great way to start. I would respectfully argue that I do think we should at least have a conversation, however briefly, in regards to retail, somewhat selfishly, because I think that there might be a way that we can incentivize that a little further, is that the heights, we've heard many times, again, I apologize, I'm sort of diving into this right now. We've heard many times from applicants that having a lower floor on the ground level really precludes what they want to do for retail. So when we've seen that over on Sherman Way and Cal Avenue area, we had a pretty animated discussion about whether a 9-foot ceiling height was enough for retail. So maybe this is a way that we can incentivize this further, where whatever the height limits are, if they do residential, we could do an additional height bonus just to make sure that their ground floor heights are as tall as possible. Because it looks like in all of this analysis, they're really focusing on plate heights being pretty much the same. So every level really is sort of uniform. And we have some visitors this morning, so apologize for the background noise. Cuteness break here. So there might be a way to incentivize a little bit of additional retail, having, some height bonus, something like that maybe they wouldn't see otherwise. And again, this sort of ties into everything else. So I don't think that we can necessarily completely ignore the retail discussion. So for what that's worth, I'm sorry, we've got the cutest little group of kids walking through the chambers right now. So hi guys. All right. So to bring it back, would we like to start with FAR?
So hold on a second.
Please.
We haven't gone through all of. I was wondering, Jean, Ryan, so far, I don't see anything about sort of a mixed density developments. Is that because they're all smaller sites, or what determines exactly, Jean, the size of a potential mixed development, say townhouses and multiple dwellings or whatever might be suggested? Secondly, on the townhouse discussion, is that an individual townhouse, or are those multiple dwelling type townhouses? How have you determined what is the size of that in terms of entry, in terms of design? I'm sure you thought about that a bit, so maybe you could, Ryan, talk about that. Jean?
To jump in here really quick, David, I want to make sure I'm understanding. So we're talking about mixed typology on a site?
Yes,
so
we're talking
townhouses
about-
okay, perfect. Okay, so yeah, I guess that a lot of these examples were smaller sites, less than an acre, and are pretty much focused on one type of housing. And we do, as brought up last ARB meeting, we have rules and regulations about mixing the typology when the property gets above a certain size. So yeah, great question.
And actually, not necessarily below 1 acre sites, because within our zoning, Jean, as you know, if it's over an acre or it's over 2 acres, it changes into a 2 or 3 prototype typologies at that point. Has that been part of the study so far, or are we leaving that for larger sites, or what?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll start and then I'll have Ryan respond about the townhome piece and sort of unit sizes. But we only tested one site. This is packet page 50 and 51. One site in the ROLM that was basically exactly 1 acre. And that site, we only looked at an apartment configuration. When you go beyond 1 acre, based on the city's standards, that's when you, yes, have it more than one housing type. We were trying to maximize the development envelope generally. And so one thing we worked with Kaiser Marston on is that, frankly, they thought our units were a little bit small. We increased the units to make them more financially feasible and more realistic in that way. But we were trying to maximize the amount of development because this was a test. And so this was only 1 acre. We did not test multiple development typologies. If we did, it's possible on this particular site on 5051 packet pages, we could have done both of those typologies, and maybe Ryan can opine on that a little bit. It certainly would have reduced our development intensity, but the idea for this particular zone in the RLM in that new focus area was not to allow townhomes. There's actually a higher minimum density. So in this case, we were not looking to do that level of mixed density. Ryan, you want to add anything there and then answer the question about the townhome topology?
I think part of our exercise was, how do we increase the feasibility of the development program on the site by allowing, a more generous building height, setbacks, things like that. The other challenge was we also knew that we had a city that was very sensitive to significant changes in building height and setbacks. And so we often strive for as much efficiency as possible in all of the site layouts that we did. And so, that was one of the guiding principles. I think when you have mixed typologies on a site, that can be, quite appealing. It's a great way to balance absorption demand in the city, introduce different folks that, would be in that development, different age groups or family types, et cetera. So, but that often comes only when you have extremely flexible zoning regulation that allows a low, quantity of townhomes to be complemented with a high density, either podium or, wrapped housing typology on a larger site. So that was part of it. The other part of it is most of our site studies were in the 5,000 to 10,000 square feet, which meant that for a developer to introduce multiple typologies could be cost prohibitive. Where we studied flats, the stacking of apartments, essentially, we did look at having a mix of 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom, different types of units, and in some cases studios. With parking requirements, oftentimes these smaller unit types like studios are heavily impacted because a parking space is, 300 square feet, 350 square feet of construction, and your studio unit is maybe 350 square feet of construction. So those are some of the considerations. When we looked at townhomes specifically, we looked at the Bay Area, family of typical products that you see, whether it's a combination, there's kind of interlocking townhomes where one unit will be a tandem parked and the next one adjacent to it will be side-by-side parking, and you have a slight variation in unit sizes and things like that, but it allows a more robust production of units on the site versus going strictly with side-by-side parking. We also looked at some very narrow prototypes that we're seeing in Berkeley, Albany, and some of the more dense cities with very small lots, just to see what the kind of max unit count would be for some of these sites using a townhome product. But we were not looking at row houses where you would have 3 units in the row house. It was 1 unit per townhouse, self-parked. Yeah.
I mean, are you saying that you don't think the other prototypes would be possible?
I think no. And, to the extent that our exercise, we're trying to figure out what is the threshold for feasibility on these small parcels. And so we studied products that were more typical to the typologies found here in the Bay Area in the Palo Alto market or in the greater Bay Area market. And so we went with a kind of a family of townhome product types, some that were small and very narrow at 12.5 feet wide, which was based on the Albany Keynes Avenue project. And then we went with the other prototypes that were based on the 16-foot and 22-foot modules. So those are some of the tools that Kaiser Marston can do an analysis and find comparable sales and development costs and do their feasibility analysis. But it doesn't mean that our recommendations for reduced setbacks or increased building height will preclude a great architect coming in and introducing new typologies. We're advocating for greater flexibility for those creative solutions, for sure.
Those are pretty good answers, but I do wonder if you can't project a little bit further into possibilities. Well, I'm a New Yorker, so of course I have substantially different kind of points of view, knowing that if I might take a moment, how living in New York for a long time, I noted the buildings that are kind of townhome type buildings, sidewall, party wall, full width property line, zero side yard, and kind of a zoning, more urban, densely urban centers, but sometimes low-rise neighborhoods that you squeeze efficiency apartments into both ends of these kind of buildings. You squeeze, say, floor-throughs that work pretty well for smaller families, and then some duplexes, et cetera. I can't imagine why these kind of prototypes aren't reasonable in some areas, in particular, for example, on El Camino, where there is a retail and zero lot line issues, why you wouldn't consider those opportunities. So, clearly the issue becomes parking right away. That seems to be the big obstacle. And in some way you've suggested that there's staged parking, multiple level parking into the lower levels there, which is expensive to begin with.
Yes.
And I think that if the opportunity existed here to do this sort of neighborhood type of idea, that you could test it out for commercial feasibility, as part of this. And without going to the end of it, would say that I love what you've done, but I think you can do more. And I hope there's an opportunity for you to do more this way, to expand it that way. So that's sort of opinionating, but nonetheless, worth mentioning at this time because I don't want it to get lost.
Thank you, David.
But I'd actually like to go back to the mixed larger scale. We've had a project last week which had that opportunity to do just exactly that. It was an over an acre property. It was split by a road in the middle, and it gave us only townhome projects on that whole site. And part of it, 14,000 square feet of an individual piece of the property could easily have been turned into a multiple family dwelling effectively. And I think that actually you look through your prototype, the actual townhomes versus apartments under 10,000 square feet in the financials, you'd see an interesting relationship there. And I'd actually ask you to look into that and determine, should that have been a mixed use project? Should we have insisted upon it?
So David, if I could, the current code requires more than one type of housing on larger than 1 acre lots. The lot you just brought up in question really was a question of whether it's 1 acre bigger or smaller. But today, I don't see any discussion about changing that that requirement. Larger than 1 acre lots are still required to have more than one housing type. Are you saying we should do more than that? Smaller lots, smaller lot sizes or bigger? What's the point you're making about how should we change
No,
the
I
code?
think it should be followed. The regulation should be followed.
Because I don't see anybody suggesting otherwise, and it seems fine with me.
No, but it leads to other discussions.
Like what though? I mean, what are we, how is that addressing what recommendations we should make about the zoning code for HIP properties?
It leads to a discussion about how you could utilize waivers and versus trade-offs, which is a big question in my
What the
mind.
architect consultant, Ryan, suggested was that by loosening zoning, you make it more feasible to have the two types you're talking about, which would certainly be the case on the project we looked at recently.
Mhm.
It was very hard to put a taller stacked flats on one property with the zoning they had to deal with. If we loosen the zoning, we'll be closer to getting what you
Absolutely,
want.
absolutely a must.
Yeah, so I think if we focus on giving them recommendations of how to encourage the housing we're trying to get, we're going to get closer to what you're driving towards, which is multiple types of
Absolutely,
houses.
you're correct about that.
So I'm of the opinion that we should flat out eliminate FAR requirements. We have other zoning that has now stepped in, which really covers why we originally created FAR. FAR is oftentimes a means of controlling the bulk of a building through a very broad allowance for architects and designers to create within that envelope of how many square feet, how big a building can be. When you have stricter daylight planes, when you rethink the height limit, when you have other requirements for open space, and when you focus on your setbacks more carefully, and when you want to encourage housing, FAR is a really weak tool to do that. As a designer, I know I feel ridiculously constrained by so many constraints, the FAR plus the daylight plane, plus in Palo Alto, the lot coverage, plus in my case, how lot coverage is determined for ADUs. It becomes ridiculous. And when I say ridiculous, it's just not productive. And the FAR is one we could easily let go. As it is, we're just pushing the number higher and higher. We have other things that we can trust will get to the same design goal. This is one we can just let go of.
I definitely think that's a bold move, as was brought up by one of the public speakers. So this is a go big moment, which I do appreciate. I think we've had discussions previously in regards to following the building envelope when we were setting up some standards for housing. And we said, you know, once you have the building envelope, you've got the volume, everything else will follow suit. So I think that we're sort of staying in line with our previous thinking on that as well. I would just say, if we are to eliminate FARs, we should make sure that we are clearly defining the open space, because I think the one potential drawback to that is that they would build, you know, corner to corner, top to bottom, and then we really would lose that open space. So we would really need to make sure that we're carefully requiring that open space amount, and whether we allow rooftop terraces or whether it needs to be a central courtyard or whether it's a U shape, whatever, it's up to the architect to decide, but we really do need to be pretty firm about that open space requirement if we are going to release that FAR.
I totally agree with that, because that was kind of where where I was heading as well in terms of the open space requirement. I think the presentation is pretty clear on if you don't require it on the ground level, but take it up to the podium level, it loosens a whole lot of possibilities. And the one thing I don't know is the open space requirement on the rooftop is allowed or not in the zoning areas right now. And if we all let go of the FAR, which I can totally be persuaded to do that, can the entire open space requirement be only on the rooftop? In which case it is setback to setback if there's no adjacent property that requires the daylight plane. It could be a pretty dense volume, and there are pros and cons to that.
Yeah, and I would also caution that if the open space is pretty much limited to the rooftop terrace, you'd be having privacy concerns with neighbors, especially at these residential adjacent parcels. So that would be one thing that I would just say, definitely open to the concept of eliminating FAR, but would want to just have a feasible discussion on open space. And Board Member Chen, you had something that added?
Yeah, I haven't think about get rid of FAR entirely, but I do agree with what board member Bolte said, that we have lots of limitations, requirements for the others, and we could somehow control FAR in another way. For example, from the height, on page, packet page 24, take the zoning CC2, for example. So the proposed standards, we agree to have 60-foot high. And also the FAR is 3.5. So based on what the other projects we have reviewed, I didn't see a project that has a FAR that is over 3.0. And some of the building heights has already been over 60 feet high. So I think somehow it will control like one way or another. So, but in the meantime, I also have the question, like, since here we limit the building height to 6 feet, 60 foot high, and then we allow them to build an FAR to a maximum of 3.5, then how can they achieve the FAR if we allowed it, but there is the building height limitation, which actually they cannot build a housing like that to that big. So there are some conflicts there.
The FAR is intended originally to control the bulk of buildings, but we have other regulations now that do that. So when you pair them together, it just makes it complex. What you're pointing out is correct, whether you can achieve a 3.5 FAR with a 60-foot height limit. But who cares what the FAR is? It's the height that we see. It's the daylight planes that affect the neighbors. Let the FAR be whatever we can create it to be. That's inside the building.
I do agree with the overall sentiment, but I would caution that, one of the benefits of a lot of these buildings is there is a space to be that's outside, right? That if you live in a shoebox, and again, not to be derogatory, that's not the intention, but if you live in a small space, you want to be able to walk outside and experience some fresh air.
I fully share your sentiments about being careful, doubly careful about parking, open space, landscaping. We need to be more careful with those things that actually control the effect of larger FAR.
Versus FAR itself. I'm in agreement with that. I guess my sort of tag to this would be, keeping the open space. I think there's actually a pretty straightforward solution to this as well, is again, just allowing for the concept of a podium and saying that open space, whatever it is 20, 30% based on, the different zoning typologies, but allowing that space to be either at ground level or at the podium. But I would just be hesitant to say it could all be on the roof. That would make me a little bit uncomfortable.
To add to this, just page 25, there's a diagram of the daylight plane. There's a dimension of from the base of the B dimension there, which is initial height of 25 feet. Peter, I'd like, you okay with that? Yeah.
Well, the beginning starting the daylight plane at 25 feet?
Yeah.
Well, I think we should come to that. Well, the daylight plane needs to be adjusted from what it is now, obviously.
All right. But I wanted to add the point that we're making here is that there is no dimension for the distance between buildings here. So the open space is in the usable outdoor space is the question, really a questionable, what is that dimension? What should it be? To be considered, Ryan, and how you diagram that.
Yeah. If I'm understanding correctly, that B height, again, if we're on packet page 25, that height of B where the daylight plane begins, I believe is changing from zone to zone. Is that accurate? Because one of the other diagrams showed 16 feet and then it's 45 degrees over. This one's saying it's 25 degrees, 25 feet and then 45 degrees over. So with the daylight plane specifically, I think the height of starting point, and again, we're stepping away from FAR a little bit here, so I do want to make sure we circle back to that. The beginning of the daylight plane, I believe, changes on site to site, and then I would also expect it to change when a property is adjacent to a residential low density property.
Absolutely.
Could you guys clarify that, please, for us?
That is what it is.
Maybe I can clarify one. So that on packet page 25, that diagram and the caption kind of explains this. That diagram is actually currently codified in the 18.24 of the municipal code in the objective standards. So that daylight plane applies when there is no daylight plane otherwise applicable to a site, and you have a building adjacent that is, I don't know what the exact height is, but a lower height building. So that's actually codified currently. The examples we were showing were, let's say you're next to an R1 site, the initial height today is 10 feet, and then the daylight planes begins. The example Ryan was showing would raise that, so that would be a modification to an existing standard. If someone was invoking the HIP to raise that height to potentially 16 feet initially in order to get that second story at the confronting property line. So what you're seeing on 25 is something that exists today. And then the idea Ryan showed is as a potential modification to an existing standard. But yes, it would depend on the district and what it was adjacent to.
As it must do. That's the whole purpose of these more sophisticated, detailed ordinances is say next to R1, maybe 16 feet. But what is on page 25, I remember us doing that. We were trying to get some level of protection for smaller existing buildings. And I think this does exactly what it should do. It's about right.
I agree.
I think what Board Member Rosenberg was alluding to is that we ought to have specific daylight planes dependent on the context, the zones, neighbors, and that's something you can adjust, you can retrofy, you can fit more carefully, we can learn from. It's a great tool to achieve what the FAR is nominally supposed to do, but it does it much better.
Agreed with that. So I guess circling back to the FAR conversation, I'd like to take a straw poll. Does the board feel comfortable eliminating FAR, understanding that we would be relying more heavily on daylight planes, height limitations, and open space requirements? So can we do a straw poll really quickly if you guys would be in favor or opposed to that?
I'd be in favor of that with a much more robust open space requirement clarification on that. Yes.
Perfect. Board Member Chen?
At this moment, I'm more reluctant to agree with that because there are lots of smarter people in town that could come ways that maybe somehow work around it. So I just want to be very cautious about to remove it entirely.
Okay. Board Member Hirsch?
Yeah. Well, I'm a little worried that we make a broad statement like that without sort of examining all of the implications.
Okay.
I'd rather actually throw it back at our consultants who I'm so pleased with their work up to date and see if they would give some serious consideration, the two of you representing all of the all of the existing zoning requirements and to see if you could, both of you, kind of come back to a consideration for this possibility that we expressed it as a opportunity to really open up everything here with changes in the city. And it's a big one if you do that one. So it would require some in-depth thinking about it, you know. So I prefer that we don't just make a broad statement without asking them to do more research.
Okay. Peter?
Well, I support what Board Member Adcock said. Clearly, I brought this up. I support getting rid of FAR, but it does have to be done carefully and with real guardrails.
Okay.
But I believe it can be done. So yes, I support that.
Okay, so we have 2 in favor and 2 with some hesitation. I admit I'm probably on the fence right now as
But
well, so.
you know, I guess if I'm putting in a vote, I'd say, yes, I'm in favor of it.
Yeah.
I want to, you know.
Okay, good. And I guess my remaining question would be, what's the, I guess, big difference between saying, okay, if it's a 60-foot height limit, we can have an FAR of 6 versus saying there's just no FAR? Is it just the complication of, I mean, because if you eliminate FAR, then we no longer need to provide diagrams to the city. We no longer need to worry about double space heights, right? Where these are places where if you had a 17-foot tall atrium, you might need to count that twice as FAR when in reality, it doesn't, you know, it's the same space.
A better way to put it is we're not eliminating FAR, we're replacing it. We're
Okay.
replacing it with other ordinances. A better time to do the straw poll perhaps is as we finish our discussion of these other items. So
No,
each of
I-
us can feel comfortable with.
I hear that. I kind of wanted to get
concept,
a
I get it.
knee-jerk reaction, which is why I took the straw poll early, is this just sort of understanding like how on board are people with this, like just right out of the gate. And if the question is that it seems to be that we need just a little bit more thoughtfulness, that's where we need to be. Okay. All right, moving on. So this ties in directly with height and daylight planes. So I'd love to hear the board's thoughts on height and daylight plane. I would like to jump in here if that's all right. That my initial thought is that this 18.24 municipal code diagram on page 25, this B height of 25 degrees, angle height of 45 degrees, that's the default right now, basically, unless something is otherwise specified, correct? No, Ms. Iceberg?
Sorry, yes, unless something is otherwise specified. So this would apply this one even applies next to a commercial site. This is purely about relationships between height. So even if it's a commercial site next door, not a residential site. So, but yes, this is the default if you're not next to a zoning district that regulates daylight plane.
Perfect. Okay. And then, so we could recommend that, that remains the default with the exception of if it's next to a low density residential property, in which case then it might default over to the 16-foot height with the 45 degrees as being proposed.
Yes, I would say that the daylight planes that we identified as being problematic are adjacent to the lower density districts that have the, for lack of a better term, more aggressive daylight plane that starts at that 10-foot height.
Okay. Okay.
What sort of concerns me is back to New York City, our 3-story height and stoop level kind of arrangement where you'd have a duplex on an upper floor and a floor through apartment on the lower floor. Again, it's a kind of a change in prototype. You end up with a facade that's approximately 50 feet high, and a stoop in front of it that gets you to the second level. It's a prototype that works pretty well, in New York City, and the scale is beautiful. I owned one of these brownstones and treated it exactly as I'm saying here. So you had the possibility of at least a 2-story full height. That wouldn't quite work with a daylight plane. I mean, the setback doesn't work with a daylight plane.
And just for clarification, the daylight plane only applies to the sides and rears, correct? It does not apply to the front facade.
That's
it is.
correct.
Is it also the front or not? No, it isn't. Huh?
No, it's not. It doesn't apply to the
Perfect.
front.
So only the rears and sides. So the front stoop situation that you're bringing up as the entry point probably
No,
would
it
not
can't
be
be
applicable.
can't be only the rear. I can't
Rear
believe-
and sides, but not the
rear and
front.
side.
So if it's a street facing
That's-
facade,
Yeah, but if it's the side, it's the face as well.
if it's a street corner, so some of the examples that they showed, it's, very clearly on the both street sides. Right. It doesn't apply to a street facing facade. It only applies when it's a neighbor.
Yeah,
on
it's
the
usually
sides.
interior property lines and the rear property
Great.
line, not side yard,
Okay.
street side yard.
Not a street side yard.
Yeah.
Okay.
Beautiful.
If I may interrupt, I am so sorry I have to leave for a meeting. I could not reschedule. I just want
Not
to
a
make
problem.
one point
Please.
about the height limits. I still feel like what is being proposed is too low in majority of these areas, particularly in RM 30 where it's 40 feet. I really appreciate that the parapet is being proposed to be removed from that height limit because that is usually what, for roof slopes and, drainage and all of that, we need that extra height, which is hard to work under when the height limit is, 30 feet or 35 feet. And it kind of like what you were alluding to earlier, it really assumes no more than 10 feet floor to floor height limit for, whether there's retail or any kind of live work units. It seems like limiting to 40 feet and still assuming 4 stories is just too low. So I don't know what it should be, but I don't think 40 feet or the 50 in the others seems like, all that discussion we had for North Ventura, I think applies here as well. It should really get at least another 5 feet, if not more, for across the board. Thank you, and I really apologize. I have to leave.
Thank you very much, Board Member Adcock. We will.
Yeah, thank you for that comment.
Thank you.
That's what I'm sort of leading to as well.
Yes. All right.
I generally support the recommended height limit increases. I could see them being even higher than that. I do think that the standard 50-foot limit would be better changed to 55 feet. That would more easily allow 5-story buildings. Board Member Rosen made an interesting comment earlier that might have some merit. If we want to encourage retail preservation, condition the extra height on having retail on the ground floor or on the use of the ground floor. Because oftentimes the reason I come up with 55 feet just by stacking 4 10-foot stories on top of a 13-foot story, that's what you need for retail. And if you have any grade change on the ground, or if you have a parapet or any roof conditions, you need extra. That's what's limiting 50 feet to really 4-story buildings, not 5. So 55 is all it takes is that extra few feet to make 5-story buildings more feasible. And all that's when you want to have the ground floor being a little bit taller, which from a design point of view is critical. Just have a little more space. It's not necessary for parking, but for almost every other architectural purpose, that extra few feet is all it takes. So I'd recommend a blanket change to the height limit to 55 feet, but otherwise the recommendations by the consultants were good, I think.
So, sorry, Peter, sorry to jump in here. So you would say that also on that RM 30 that's recommended at 40 feet, you would switch that to 50?
There I would make it 45.
Okay, so
Yeah.
basically everything, so there's like the 60 foot, 60 foot, 50 foot, 50 foot, and 40 foot. You change all of those up by 5 feet?
I think 5 feet is what you need to realistically get the designs to work the way we're trying to.
Okay, and maintaining that the parapets are not included. And just out of curiosity, is there a height maximum on those parapets? We don't really need 10-foot parapets on top of all these buildings, do we?
I don't know that there is now, but if we were going to remove it, I think we probably would want that.
I'm not in favor of removing that. I think you add unnecessary complexity to the design.
What do you
start measuring the height of the building from some sort of roof elevation behind the parapet, all roofs are sloped.
Right.
So where do you measure that from? The height is something that really regulates what we see. That's what I was talking about before, that instead of the FAR, we're going to use things like height limit. That's what you see. Your parapet is what you see. Let the architect design the function of the building behind the parapet as necessary. And don't get the planners trying to measure the structure of the roof form. That
No.
changes as you go through design.
Yeah, no, the reason that I'm asking that is because they were basically saying that they wanted to measure to the roof height and not the parapet height. So that was
Yeah.
the proposal. And
I
my
don't-
concern is I don't
Yeah, I'm
necessarily
sorry,
want.
I didn't be clear. I don't agree with that at all.
Okay, so I'm not, and then that was, I think, one of Board Member Adcock's comments on her way out is that, and I don't want to speak for her, but it seemed that she was in favor of that. I'm not opposed to sort of ignoring the parapet wall to an extent, but at that point, I sort of feel like it would need to be stepped back, or it would need to be mesh, or it would need to be something. I mean, in some of these diagrams, like for example, on packet page 37, looking at the modified CDC zoning standards, you can see that the building goes, the roof goes all the way up to the dashed line at the top, and then the parapet extends beyond. Not necessarily opposed to it, but I would feel like that is affecting volume, which is sort of counter, it's going against what we're requiring with the daylight planes and height limits. So the question would be, do you want to maintain that the parapet, per the recommendations on the PTC, that the parapet's not included, or should we include it but give them 5 feet extra?
Well, I just
height
give them
limit?
extra space.
Okay.
That's what I'm pushing for.
Got it.
The extra
Okay.
space is in fact allowing for a parapet. I've got on my
Correct.
sketch here 3 feet, assuming that's a typical parapet. They vary all over the place. It's so dependent on your construction type.
Wouldn't it need to be 42 inches guardrail height?
It might if it's a guardrail, but if
Yeah.
it's not a guardrail for waterproofing purposes, constructability,
Okay,
you're not required to have a guardrail up there. It depends on your access to the roof.
fair. Okay.
Board Clear is trying to say
Oh,
something.
please.
Chair, may I just, I think that proposed change actually came from the changes that were made to the focus area regulations.
Mhm.
So we did change the definition of height, but the way that the code was worded was railings and parapets shall be excluded from height calculations in this table 3 only to the extent they are required for health and safety standards in titles 15 and 16 of the code. So basically limited to the OSHA standards for height.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
That's
Yeah.
it.
Excellent.
You're just adding complexity.
No, no,
To
I'm
make
not
that-
trying to, ooh, I'm so
yeah,
sorry.
Just
Um,
leave it to what you see.
Not trying to add complexity, just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with what's, if we're going to discount the parapets, which I have no opposition to, I just want to make sure that's not going to be an 8-foot tall extension of the
I'm
facade.
arguing that we shouldn't discount the parapets. Height limits should govern what you see.
Right, but what's
the
being
per-
proposed to us is they do.
Well, what she just read is something, when you have that exception about OSHA standards,
Mhm.
all of a sudden the planning staff is governing,
Right.
making that call, and that's a tough one to make.
Mhm.
I don't know if I could do that, and it's really hard for them. They're not building professionals that way. So it's putting planning mixed into really technical details of building.
Well, no, and I guess in a way, I'm trying to make this a little bit less complicated is let's say the height goes to the height, right? And that's the top of roof, whatever that is, and you can add up to a 42-inch parapet beyond the height limit. And I don't have any objection to that per se.
Well, that is in the assumption that all the buildings are with flat roof and
Mhm.
there's no roof plate height change, right? So
Correct.
it depends on where, shall we just measure it from the edge of the street, like the frontage, or it will make things more complicated. So I agree with what Board Member Bolte said. Since here, our role is to make sure the overall building massing is
Mhm.
compatible. So
Okay.
I think it makes sense to include the parapet wall height.
Include it in the height measurements. Okay, I mean, I'm persuaded. So we would say that if I'm understanding correctly, Board Members Chen and Board Member Balte, you guys are vying for adding an extra 5 feet across the board to each one of these height limits, but making it so that the parapet is included in the height.
Well,
Yes, absolutely.
Before doing that, I have a couple of questions want to double check. So for the, especially for the zoning CC2, that one seems has a huge jumps for the building height requirement from 37 to 60 foot. So I want to make sure CC2, is it on packet page 24, the chart?
Mhm.
It has everything there. So I want to
Oh,
make
yeah.
sure that for CC2, is it only on the Cal Ave, that area, or is there any area else also CC2 that?
That is only on California Avenue.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. And also here, another question is, actually, I'm not sure if 5 foot height, additional 5 foot height is enough, if that is only that area, because it's more commercial area now. And also since here, based on the table, what here, the FAR allowed is 3.5, actually, we might need more heights to be allowed. Because just based on the projects we have been seeing for the FAR that is 3.0 or 2.7 or so, it has already achieved being above 60 foot height. So I'm wondering whether we should allow them to go much higher in this case.
Which zoning district are you referring to?
CC2.
Through the chair, if I may ask a clarifying
Please.
question.
Please.
When proposing this idea of increasing the height by 5 feet for each of the zones, is that above the proposed increases? So in addition?
Correct.
Okay, so
In
it's
addition to
not
what's
a
being proposed.
5 feet addition to the existing regulations. It's 5 feet above
Yep.
the scenario that's been prepared by our consultant.
Correct. So
Okay,
the scenario
thank
that's been proposed, thank you for the clarification question. I'm very glad that you made sure that that was crystal clear. Yes, it's everything that's been proposed by the consultants. We seem to be more or less in agreement with. We are looking to add that additional 5 feet to account for, as Board Member Balte explained, the potential grade changes from one side of a site to another. We're pretty flat area in general, but it does happen, and you can have a 2-foot shift over one side very easily. That happens all the time. So we'd want to make sure to account for that, and then to include those parapets and not allow those to extend beyond the height limit. We really want to regulate the exterior envelope of the building and give a lot more freedom to the inside. So really sort of setting a really firm boundary of frame, and then allow the developers to have a lot more area to paint within the frame, if that makes sense.
The 5 foot is essentially 42 inches at the parapet and 18 inches at the ground, which is an approximation of what's typically the case.
But at this point, that increase of 5 feet for the overall height, you have not discussed any additional changes to the daylight plane.
No, no, no.
Okay,
no, no.
just
The
just
daylight
confirming.
plane
Thank you.
is separate in that regard.
Great clarification questions.
All right, thank you. And yeah, so to me, like for CC2, are we can still consider like six foot high is enough, or maybe we should go up to 70 foot so that it could have one more story high?
I think you'd need 75 feet to have an
Oh,
extra
yeah.
story.
Yeah,
So I
that's
think
right.
65 is the right number for
Yeah, right.
CC2, in my
Mhm,
opinion.
yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I do admit, I always go, I studied abroad in Barcelona. So I'm always, as board member Hirsch is always going back to New York, I always go back to Barcelona, and that the Le Champ grid of the 6-story high buildings, it's beautifully proportioned for a reason, right? It's one of the most beautiful cities because of that. And because of the maintaining the context between the height of the buildings and the street themselves, and that you could stand on the sidewalk and, holler, but communicate with someone on the 6th floor. So I don't necessarily want this city to end up having 100-foot tall buildings, 75-foot tall buildings. I think that the 60-foot is appropriate for what we have. And if future development, 50 years from now changes this again, then that's one thing. But I think this is a really solid step in the right direction at the 65-foot height limit.
Yeah, I'd recommend to staff that sell this to the planning commission and the council, of saying we're not really increasing, we're just changing the way we define these secondary parts of it, grade changes and the parapet heights.
How does this deal with if you have a somewhat larger site?
Microphone.
If you have a somewhat larger site, what happens? What happens if it's larger than the potential 5-foot high max out? 60-foot max out.
So
I'm saying
why would you increase the height limit if you have a larger
if the site allows you more bulk, would you be allowed to go higher?
Are you basically asking if there's like a 2-acre property, maybe you should be allowed to go higher because it's its own space?
What happens then?
I mean, truth be told, I'm inclined to just keep it the same height for now. Simply because, again, sort of ease of development, right? Once we start getting into, if you're plus or minus 2 acres, then somebody's, gonna potentially buy a property that's just under 2 acres because they can do this or just over. And so it's.
So David, you're a New Yorker. If you go down Park Avenue, they have daylight planes on the street frontage. That answers their question. You can make them tall, but you have to step back as you look down Park Avenue.
Yes, that's fine.
So we don't have that. And nobody's proposing daylight planes or setbacks at height along El Camino. So that's where the height limit is important. 65 feet is a 6-story building. And we're sort of saying that's what we want to plan for.
So the taller buildings generally, from my experience on working on penthouses, on tops of these buildings, they're usually set far back. Actually, frankly, they were at some point in history on some buildings, they were kind of the staff rooms at the top, bedrooms for staff. But nowadays they actually became penthouses. So how do you deal with a penthouse?
Well, you could persuade me to eliminate height limits and just rely on daylight planes. So at 25 feet and 45 degrees, there's very few properties that are going to get above 65 feet with those kind of strict daylight planes. So it wouldn't matter.
There'll be some. There'll be some somewhere.
So does mean
May I say one quick thing about building
Please.
heights? In terms of the building code, there are typologies in terms of construction that we see kind of all day long. And so say you're in an instance where you have a podium and then you have housing construction on top of that. So the max wood frame you're going to see above the podium will be 5 stories. And then your podium could be 1 or 2 stories, depending on how it houses parking. And so if it has 2 levels of structured parking, you're looking at a 20 to 22-foot podium. So you have 22 feet plus 5 stories, is a common typology that you see throughout the entire Bay Area. for that particular type of construction. And you see another common typology is if you have your structured parking is wrapped, where you're not vertically stacking the parking, but the parking is wrapped by the housing, then you'll see a lower building, that kind of maxes out at the 5 stories, which will be in that 50 to 55 foot range. Another important consideration is for retail heights. You mentioned 13 feet, but I'm much more familiar seeing if it's a good retail district and you have strong restaurants or demand for, tenants that are going to pay rent that might cover the construction of that space, they expect an 18-foot floor to floor for retail, maybe a 16.5 minimum. So it somewhat depends. If you're looking at, kind of Class A retail tenants, you want flexibility to have a higher retail level, up to 18 feet. If you're looking at a very dense project on a somewhat smaller site, then you want to have flexibility to have a 2-story podium. And so, when you look at the 65-foot height limit, that will accommodate 4 stories over a 2-story podium comfortably, but it won't allow the developer that 5th story. And so, we're looking at ways to, compete against the state density bonus laws. And so the more you can align your building height rules with kind of the maximum efficiency within a typology, then you can get closer to incentivizing folks to embrace the HIP versus going to state density. The other big thing that makes us very different than New York or other older cities is in this area of California, there's a massive cost threshold between the high-rise construction, which is triggered after your top floor exceeds 75 feet in height. So, basically what you'll see is the predominant construction typology under that height limit will be wood frame, either type 3 or type 5 over a podium, or, in a wrapped configuration on the ground. If you start to get into the high rise, which has different exiting requirements, construction requirements, then those buildings usually go up quite a bit more, to like you're looking at 10 stories to start hitting feasibility, or 11 or 12, which is. So anyway, I think if we focus on the construction typologies that comfortably live under that high rise, you can find efficiency. And so that's kind of, and penthouses, I think that's something where obviously we're going to allow them if somebody wants to have that setback, but forcing a penthouse to have that setback at that upper level could add a lot of cost to a project. And that's one of the things that a lot of cities have required step backs at the upper levels. And that's oftentimes one of the first things that a developer will waive using the state density bonus laws.
I just want to make a comment about this because I'm noting almost all of the major buildings in downtown Redwood City are taller than that. Did you examine their prototypes, and have we some knowledge of the construction cost for buildings like that? Because I think we're going to be having a fight with developers who want to build that kind of density into projects. I'm not saying I favor it particularly. I don't. In fact, if you look at the massive nature of much of those structures, I see there's a problem of scale. There's a problem to do with our own objective standards, which really require a lot of change. I much prefer the 5 or 6 story building with a lot of articulation. Of course, the scale is just so much better, but there simply are a lot of buildings in Redwood City that certainly violate that. And are they unmarketable? Because what we're saying to developers is that they can't build that dense type of building. They can't do it. They're not allowed to do it, right? If we agree to everything we're talking about here. Ryan, are you?
Well, so what I will say is that I guess what I'm advocating is as we set these height limits, is that we take into consideration what the natural efficiency is of the typologies that live under that high-rise threshold. And, if we can set our objective design standards around a very, efficient, it can be beautifully articulated, but if we set our design standards around an efficient, building product, which either allows 4 or 5 stories above a podium, which that being the max density that you'll see with the wood frame typology, then I think you have a chance at getting developers to embrace the HIP. So the reason I bring that up is as we look at the commercial districts, if we go with a 65-foot height limit that includes the parapet, and it's a strong retail address, and that developer wants to do a proper 18-foot floor-to-floor on the residential, then they'll have a 4-story opportunity above that retail, space, which may work financially or may not. I don't know, but we are, keeping them from doing that 5th level with that height limit set at 60 to 65. So those are just considerations that I'm kind of putting out there, for all of you to consider. I don't, going into the high-rise territory, is a very difficult move for developers. So, I don't know if you need to design your odds around that, but I do think designing your odds around the building code allowances for type 5, type 3 construction is really important.
Could you clarify for me, please, since we have you here? I had recommended going to 65 feet from 60. I think what I'm hearing you say is that doesn't matter that much. If we want to say, anticipate 4 stories above a 2-story podium, you think 60 feet is adequate anyway?
Well, so I have a bias. I prefer top of structure for the height limit requirement because it allows an architect to have a little more freedom in how the massing is articulated, and you don't get a flat top building. So you can have maybe the corner be, a 6-foot parapet, and then it drops to a 4-foot parapet or things like that. Whereas if you restrict the parapet height to 65 feet, they're going to be pretty judicious, because you got to screen mechanical units, you have to do all these different things. It can be a bit more restrictive in terms of architectural expression, but I still think you can get a nice building at 65 feet if you include the parapet. But I'm just sharing my bias.
But let me get you to focus on this, please, though. If what I see in the pamphlet, what I see you recommending is a 60-foot limit. And we seem to be saying, let's go 5 feet further. And I want to know if you think that's an improvement or you think it doesn't going to change our attractiveness compared to the state density bonus law.
Well, so when we put those recommendations there, they were based somewhat on feedback through the process from the city. In terms of, an architect's perspective on this, and my voice alone, not taking into consideration all the other voices that have been part of these recommendations, is that I feel allowing up to 5 stories over a 2-story podium opens up a bigger door for development solutions on these smaller parcels, especially in your commercial districts. So in that case, you're looking at 50 feet plus 20 feet plus 5 feet, like 75 feet is not an atypical height for that kind of product, where you have a 2-story podium plus 5 stories wood frame construction. But that's my voice alone, and Jeannie can attest that there have been a lot of voices that have been part of this process. And part of that was looking at Kaiser Marston. One benefit that Palo Alto has is your land values are extremely high, your rents are extremely high, and there was support for going with a 4-story over a 2-story podium when we were doing those tests.
But just to be clear, there's no point in this commentary or this packet that we've reviewed as anyone proposing a 75-foot structure. Is that accurate?
Right.
So
That
it's a
was too aggressive, I think.
Okay.
based on the
And-
process.
Yeah, and I believe part of that is, as much as we do need to get housing and as much as we want to, that we also are a city that has a pretty rich history of what our city is and what it feels like. And I think that jumping up to a much more massive, and again, I understand there's a tipping point when we get to the high rises. If we became a high rise city, that very much changed the fabric of our community and the fabric of who we are as a city. So I would encourage my fellow board members to sort of maintain that in mind as to when we're thinking about these height limits. Yeah, we've got some existing structures that we want to respect as well. So
I'm going to stand behind thinking we should add 5 feet to the recommendations based on justification for parapets and grading, and leave the measurement top of building to the ground.
okay, I would agree with that.
You're mentioning, Ryan, you're mentioning podiums, but we've been looking at buildings in which the parking is entirely underground. 2 levels of parking below grade. So of course, that's another consideration, isn't it? I mean, to have a podium and give up levels above grade where you could have potential real use of the land isn't really what's going to happen here.
Yeah, and I would argue that it's up to the developer at any point. If they want to go 2 stories below grade, they have every right to, and then they can take that 65-foot height limit and put all of it as housing, right? So
Correct.
they always have that option, right? We're not precluding, the benefit of going underground is still there. Yes, it costs a bit more, but it's like quote unquote free area to develop, that they could go down 2-3 stories if they wanted to get that parking in there if they really needed to, and they really wanted to make more housing units above. So I'm still very comfortable with this. I'm actually not necessarily sure I would want to encourage a 2-story podium of parking and mechanical for all of these units. I think that really detaches the buildings from the sidewalk, and that would make me a bit more uncomfortable in terms of how these buildings associate with the neighbors and with the sidewalk and with, walking down the street. So I am inclined to say that keeping that height limit, as we've sort of discussed, is appropriate. But this actually feeds right into the third comment, or the third topic that we would want to discuss, which is parking.
Well,
And there was,
before
ahead,
we move
please.
into parking, the daylight plan, are we all comfortable to raise it from 10 to 16 when it's adjacent to R1 zone?
It's a really good question. I very simply in my mind, I feel that the 16-foot at 45 degrees next to residential can be just across the board for every one of these zonings that I feel comfortable with, especially knowing that we've got ADU laws that are allowing 16-foot buildings right next door, 4 feet from the property line anyway. So to me, that makes a lot of sense. And then having that default of the 18.24 municipal code which is a 25-foot height limit and 45-foot setback, sort of if it's not next to a residential, that seems pretty straightforward and clean in my mind.
I've given a lot of thought to this, Board Member Chen, because it's a significant impact on an R1 property.
Yes, very much.
When you're next to what's going to be an RM30 apartment building or townhouse. Keeping the daylight plan at 10 feet is a significant impact on our ability to create housing. And we're looking for a balance. We all have to compromise a little bit. So I've landed thinking 16 feet is a fair compromise if we have good guardrails for privacy protection, which is where landscaping is going to come in. That's my thinking. It's not ideal. I wish we had more land, but we don't.
Yeah, I agree. I got your point, but still R1 is R1 zoning, right? And we are here trying to achieve the privacy for those for people who live there. So, or maybe, I know R1 zoning is not a topic we are talking about today, but it seems like if an R1 zoning house adjacent to a, say, RM20 or 30 multifamily house, compared to R1 next to R1, then it's one neighbor looking over their backyard versus a few units looking to that backyard. So considering the privacy, how much impact it will have, and then does it mean, is it reasonable for us to change R1 zone to raise the daylight plan height for the entire R1 zone as well, because the privacy issues, right? So, and as you mentioned, the ADU, it's not, the daylight plan for ADU is still start from 8 or 10, depends on the setback, right?
No,
So,
no, no,
and the
you're- no,
maximum
but
is
that's not
16
correct.
feet.
ADU can be 16 feet tall at 4-foot property line.
Right, yeah,
So that's
but,
much greater.
but the
That's a
maximum,
12-foot daylight.
yeah,
line.
that is the maximum of the ADU height, building height
Right,
is 16 feet. It's not like but the daylight plan from the property line,
Well, that would be a 12-foot starting point at the property line. 45 degrees over brings you to
is it
16
12
feet.
feet?
Well, it's de facto 12 feet,
Right, yeah.
but ADUs have an impact on R1 properties.
Yeah, 4
there's no
feet and 8
question.
feet.
And that's,
But here we are talking about 16 feet from the property line, right? So it's still a big difference compared to what allows.
I absolutely agree. It's a big difference. And we have to, I believe we have to allow the housing, but we need to provide greater protections to the neighboring properties with other means that also allow the housing. That's what I mean by guardrails. So we tried to do that in our objective standards where we have quite tight definitions of balconies and windows when you're looking at other properties.
Right.
And I don't think we should relax those at all. In fact, by our trying to incentivize builders to use the HIP program, we're forcing them to follow those objective standards. And the state density law, they can ignore them. They can waive things like privacy requirements.
Well,
So
yeah, actually, there are a number of properties for under our RM20 or RM30 in Midtown or along Alma Street. So it will be a huge impact to the R1 zone who are adjacent to them. It's not like only a few of them, but it's a huge impact to all the people living next to the
So
RM20 or
think of it
30.
this way, though, to get more comfort with this. It's a huge impact to them, but if you use the state density bonus law instead, it lessens the impact. And we're trying to drive builders to do that.
Right.
We
And
can only do so much. We just can't say, 10-foot setbacks and daylight plane on all against any R1 property. We don't have that. Our hands are tied. And Sacramento's telling us to do better than that because we have a real issue with housing. So we have to relax something.
yeah. In this case, the rear yard setback and the side yard back has already been reduced, and the building can be much closer to the property line. And then we are even allowed to have a more generous daylight plan. So which means it is
Still better than the state density bonus law allowances.
yeah, I agree, but still, like there are. I just feel we should treat the properties adjacent to R1 zone should be treated differently.
I agree. We should establish a tight control of the daylight plane, and we should establish tight controls of landscaping requirements, tight controls of additional privacy requirements, things like balconies facing daylight R1 neighbors.
Yeah.
We already have those controls started.
Yeah, I have no issues if they're adjacent to other zonings, but it's just R1, it's a huge impact.
I think there's some frankly, I think there are questions as to some of the detail that we've been asking for privacy issues, that angled windows or height of windows off the floor. They're just not natural, not normal, not useful. But landscape is the key privacy possibility.
That's why it's discussion item number 4, if we get to it.
Yes, okay.
At least I believe so.
Okay, I'm happy with that.
Can I chime in on the parking requirements? In 30 years of working in Palo Alto, doing mostly residential, but some multifamily, I'm constantly amazed at the complexities and restraints that the parking brings to the projects. I believe we should require a maximum of 1 parking space per unit, regardless of the size of the unit. We should consider having no parking requirement for studio size units. We should have some overlay requirement of additional parking for service uses, things like Uber drop-offs, deliveries. But if we were to establish a maximum amount of parking of 1 per unit plus services, we would actually achieve a lot of goals that we're trying to achieve in Palo Alto: reduction of parking and traffic, reduction of load on our infrastructure. Many people who are going to live in these stacked flat apartments will only have 1 vehicle anyway. this only encourages that. It encourages the use of mass transit, which we're all pushing for. There are so many benefits in our society of us having fewer cars. When we mandate zoning that requires more parking spaces, we incentivize the use of vehicles like that. It's all backwards. So I come around wanting to have a maximum of one parking space per unit.
I have a pretty knee-jerk strong reaction to that. I don't think that we should ever have a maximum of parking. I think if someone wants to go into a 3-story underground parking garage and lease them out and make money that way, I think that's absolutely fine. If that's a way that a developer wants to do that, I don't think we have any business sort of maximizing. Now, I do agree with sort of the recommendations that we should meet the state standards on the minimum parking requirements. And I think we absolutely can reduce the minimums, but I would be very hesitant to impose a maximum because again, it sort of feels like an overstep where it's not really our business if they want to add more, but we can definitely make it easier for them to add less. So that would be my approach personally.
So the state requires it. I don't see why we shouldn't go along with the state regulation.
I would just match state and
I'm proposing to go beyond the state regulation. The state is, I believe, 1.5 spaces per 2-bedroom unit. Is that right? That's what's in the packet here.
Correct.
Yeah, so I'm arguing for less parking than
I would reduce it to 1.
I'm saying reduce it to 1. And consider reducing it to 0 for studios even. But reduce it to, if we just get that, that's a big change. 1 parking space per unit.
I mean, I'm comfortable with reductions again. It's just, I hesitate at the concept of imposing a maximum, I guess would be my comment.
I take back that
Yeah.
concept. I'm just saying, let's go to 1 space per unit. Keep it simple. The parking drives the 2-story podium the gentleman's talking about. The parking drives how much retail you can actually fit, drives so much on the ground floor. When you can't affordably put underground parking, then it really governs so much of the design of these projects. We see that over and over again, especially on small lots. An additional thought on the parking is to have no parking requirement for commercial uses. We often see that somebody wants to put a coffee shop in, but a coffee shop is a restaurant. You're looking at 1 space for 50 square feet. If they do takeout, all of a sudden it's ridiculous. They need to provide 10 parking spaces for that little restaurant. Get rid of that. Lighten the parking load and a lot of this will fall into place.
Do you have any concerns that by reducing the parking requirements, you might be accidentally encouraging micro units, studios, things like that?
I think that's great.
Okay.
I'd like to see encouragement of all sizes of units. And
So
let the market
Right, so
decide.
over there too, just 1 second. So your recommendation would be no parking for studios or micro units, 1 space required for 1 or 2-bedroom units, and no parking for commercial/retail. Is that what you're requesting,
Well,
suggesting?
He gave in on
let me modify that. I want to be more political. I'd just say
Please.
1 parking space per unit, period. Provide additional service required spaces as the planning department needs.
Mhm.
And then no spaces for commercial use.
But okay, so this flipped a little bit. So you had originally said no spaces required for studios.
I'm going to back off of that.
Okay.
The way you phrased it made me scratch my head and think about it. And if we can agree on even that, I think we've made real progress.
Right, but saying 1 space for studios up to 2-bedroom units.
Just 1 space per unit,
So if you-
period.
Period.
Keep it simple. Again, it's very plannable.
Yeah, and I agree to reduce the parking requirement for whoever live there, but I also understand the state law, it also encouraged to reduce parking requirement, but in reality, I have mixed feeling about parking requirement because these are all housing projects and some of them will have retail or all kinds of things that say if this building has 100 units and just a few of them has guests coming here during the weekend, where shall they park? And that's always a question we ask the applicant that is the issue that in reality we need to somehow resolve, and we should not just rely on the adjacent property to solve the problem or street parking. So for all this housing project with all the high density units there, guest parking is somehow has a
That's what I
As
mean
needed.
by service parking, I called it, but I would say something like 10%, 20% extra of spaces. So when one family has a bunch of guests, or when you have two painting trucks working on your apartment, or a few deliveries, you absolutely need more than just the one space per unit. One
Right.
space per unit is assigned to that unit.
Right.
And I don't know what that amount would be, but the planning staff is pretty good at working on that.
Yeah.
Come up
Yeah.
with some additional requirement that you need for service, for visitors, things like that.
Mhm.
So again, I'm gonna ask actually the same question that I asked you a moment ago, just to make sure. So are you worried that by requiring one space per unit, you're gonna actually now discourage micro units and studios? Because in a space where they could get studio apartments and they could get 100, maybe they have to get 50 for one bedrooms. I apologize. I'm just trying to bring up the potential pitfalls and benefits to each of these is right, is that if you say no parking's required for a studio, then all of a sudden we're gonna have this balloon of studio apartments because that's easier. If we say there's one per unit, and they could do one parking space for a 3-bedroom unit or for a studio, right? How are we accidentally, what's the unintended consequence of encouraging or discouraging one parking space per unit?
Okay, well, I appreciate
Sorry.
that line of thinking because you're absolutely right. We want to suss out what the unintended consequences are. We're suffering from a lot of that already with our parking regulations. Why don't you answer the question for me? What do you think would be the best way?
It is a very interesting concept. I actually really like your commentary that maybe the service units would be required at a 1 to something ratio of number of units, right? So let's say we have no parking required for studios, right? We will see an increase of studio units because no parking is required and you can fit a whole bunch of them in there. Now, however, the flip side of that is, let's say somebody puts 50 units in there and we say, okay, you're required to have one service space per 10 units. All of a sudden they're required to have 5 service spaces, but no parking spaces for the people that live there. So they're still required to have parking. They're still going to have a lot there. But for the people that live there, it's not going to be dedicated to them, but they're still allowing guest parking, Amazon parking, things like that. So I think there's a way to, without overcomplicating, really don't want to overcomplicate this, but I think that I'd be amenable to not having parking spaces for studios. However, making sure that each unit is counted in the required minimum parking for service spaces. And I think that will balance out fairly nicely. Does that make sense? So if someone wanted to do 100 studios, they'd still have to have, whether it's a 1 to 10 or 1 to 20 ratio, something like that, that they would still have to have some amount of service spaces.
Yeah, that's a good idea. You could just say you have half a space per studio to sort of split the difference.
That's a
But,
good idea.
what I'm really driving towards, however we parse it out, is to reduce the amount of parking that's required. I think the parking drives the projects beyond what's reasonable. And we want to incentivize housing. We want to incentivize people following our program. So if we can eliminate or reduce the amount of parking that's required, that's good.
So the same, do we want to make a difference whether the property is within half mile from the Caltrain or
Well,
further?
I think that just wipes out the whole question, doesn't it? If you're within a half mile of Caltrain, you don't need parking, period. So it doesn't affect anything we say. I found that there's variability in how that's measured, and we've seen that in practice. In actuality, I've raised that question with staff several times and get different answers. And they give me different answers because the law is very sloppily written. And so, again, those are things we're all working through as we try to work through these increased regulations. The bottom line is that we require too much parking, which just incentivizes a car-centric society. And we're suffering from that. Traffic is greater than ever before. We have more carbon problems in the atmosphere than ever before. All of this comes from use of automobiles. So to the extent that we can incentivize the reduction in that, we're better off. So I think one space per
there's
unit.
some additional problems here is that I see that people who are developing some commercial space are going to want to have parking nearby. And they're going to run into an even greater problem. You're going to hear screaming about this, spending the money, for example, like we've seen, for example, near my house on Middlefield, a small medical building that is surrounded by parking lot. I think when it's a mix of housing and commercial, it's going to cause a big problem with the commercial tenants and developers to think about. I'm just proposing to come out with something about this. How do you determine this?
My observation has been that many developers use the excuse of being required to provide parking as a reason why they can't provide retail or commercial stuff. And I've seen that happen on this board a number of years ago. The Protege restaurant was going in on California Avenue.
That's
And-
California Avenue.
Well, but listen to the example that the developer wanted the developer was taking over that space and it was rated for retail, but not restaurant use. And the only way to convert it was to add 8 or 10 parking places. So at enormous expense, they converted a back parking space into a series of stacked lifts that got them the minimum requirement. And it was nothing that a guest to that restaurant would ever use. And yet our code was so rigid that they actually had to spend $500,000 or something to put this in. I vividly remember sitting here and the 2 chefs are in that table over there in that chair, just sort of complaining to us that, hey, how can we survive in this tough retail environment, trying to put in a world-class restaurant, which is great for Palo Alto. And you're making us spend this money on parking that we don't need or will never use. And yet that's what they had to do. Parking drives so much. Just let it go, David. If the restaurant needs parking, they'll figure out what they need. Don't mandate it. Many, many restaurants in New York don't have parking lots.
I'm not
Being a devil-
mandating.
You're being
I'm
a devil's advocate, raising the question.
suggesting that the retailer is going to mandate it in some
They
way.
might, then they should, that may drive where they put their retail.
Okay. I do want to sort of summarize this. Are we comfortable as a board recommending half a space for studios, or would we like to recommend no spaces for studios?
I think what we said, Kendra, was just 1 space per unit. and leave it
Correct,
simple.
but then we backed off on
Well,
that because I asked you a
I'm trying to
follow-up
say
question.
what's going to get us 4 votes here and what's going to get us
Right.
7 votes on planning commission and council, because that's what really counts.
Right, I guess my concern is that I think if we limit it to 1 space per unit, you're going to unintendedly see a ballooning of, I mean, you're actually going to see a reduction in some of the micro and efficiency units. And you might see extra 3-bedroom units, which is great, but that brings us right back to townhouses, which is what we can get in other places anyway. So with these sort of higher density units, I would like to encourage a little bit less of the parking, and I'm amenable to either having a half a space for a studio, but I kind of feel like with the square footage, right, number of square feet, you're going to sort of end up where you would anyway, with a 1-bedroom to a studio. So 2 studios equals 1 parking space, 1 bedroom equals 1 parking space in terms of square footage, right? Or we could eliminate the parking space for studios, but then have a slightly higher count for the service units. So if we say it's 1 to 20 units, you have to provide a service parking space. So I'm trying to figure out sort of the best way to do this to balance a reduction in parking, but not make it so egregious that they're really, highly favoring one prototype of housing over another. I feel very comfortable saying 1 parking space for 1, 2, 3-bedroom units, fine. People that live there will figure it out. I don't necessarily see a concern there, but I'm curious about these efficiency units and the spaces there. But I think a potential solution is just saying, listen, if you've got a service requirement of, I'm throwing out this number of 1 to 20, maybe it's 1 to 15, maybe it's 1 to 10, maybe it's 1 to 30. But if you have X amount of units, you need to provide 1 service space. And I think that's a way to sort of balance this out so we can reduce the requirement with studios and say no parking space is required for studios, but every 20 units has to have 1 service space.
Sure, I can support that.
How do you feel about that, Board Member Chen?
Yeah, I was thinking about it. So if we're in the developer standpoint of view, how can we make sure that their business model is successful, right? We don't want them to be in a situation that nobody come here to rent or buy the house because there is no enough parking for whoever live there. Because,
Agreed, but again, we're not
Right.
making maximums, we're making
right,
minimums.
yes.
So they get to choose, and if they think, based on their research, that not having parking is going to make it so that their units are unrentable, that's up to them to decide.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, so, and another thing is I think we should somehow make a difference between whether it's a studio or 1 bedroom versus 2 bedroom larger units, because I think that will also encourage a variety size of the
Mhm.
housing types to meet different family sizes needs.
Agreed, and I think part of my intention of having, the tipping point be a 1 bedroom versus a no bedroom is that if you have a family of any type, they typically will want a little bit more privacy, right? When it's a solo person, they can live in an efficiency or a studio unit pretty easily. And so once you need that modicum of privacy, which is the definition of a 1 bedroom, then you might need a parking space. And then, but the difference between a 1 bedroom and a 3 bedroom, the developer might realize that, oh, this corner unit here, we can do a 3 bedroom, but there's no penalization for an extra parking space. So then they can add 1 bedroom, which is maybe 200 square feet of square footage, and not be penalized with an additional parking space. So that's where I say 1 bedroom and up, 1 parking space, less than a bedroom, no parking space. Does that make sense? Board members agree, more or less? Okay, and then how do we feel about, again, I sort of started with this 1 to 20 unit of service parking spaces. Do we want to try and define that right now? Do we want to point that back to
I would leave that
PTC?
to the pros. I mean, these
Okay.
guys are the ones who really know.
Perfect.
And that takes some
Yeah,
detailed study
agreed.
to figure that out, I would think.
Agreed. Okay.
I know it when I see it, when it's not there, but I don't know how much they should have.
TC and planning. Okay, perfect. So we'll leave that, but I do think that having
PTC, the T stands for transportation,
transportation.
doesn't it? Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, so they might be the experts in that. So I would just say that having a lower ratio, so, more parking spaces required for service based on the number of units. We wouldn't want to be a 1 to 40. We might be less than that, right? So a tighter ratio.
I just want to throw a number there. When David and I are studying on the townhomes, and based on our study, there are some design guidelines. The ratio is 1 per 3 units to provide a gas parking, but that is pretty high. So so maybe we will start from there, and
So not 1 to 3 and not 1 to 40. So somewhere in the middle. Sounds good. Thank you for that. I appreciate that data point. All right, we've got 2 items left to discuss. I'm feeling pretty good about the FAR, the height, daylight planning, parking, open space and retail. We are coming up on the time limit. We're past our time of when I was hoping this meeting would wrap, but this is a very important thing. So I do want to respect everyone's time and the staff's time as well. So open space, and then the last item would be retail. So let's dive into open space. I am very comfortable with what's been proposed. And I think that allowing for open space to either be at ground level or podium is a great start. I would be concerned about making it so that open space could be only on the rooftop. I think that we should absolutely allow rooftop terraces because I think that's another viable opportunity for more increase of open space, but I would be hesitant to allow only on the rooftop.
So if I recall correctly, in our objective standards, we put pretty significant guardrails against rooftop open space close to the edges where the privacy impacts occur.
Correct.
When you have rooftop open space that protects people's privacy, then it's great. It really works. So again, it comes down to the details of how you get privacy protection, which is what I think is the right answer. Who cares if it's on the roof as long as it doesn't bother the neighbors?
Correct. I guess my concern is if it's only on the roof, then A, you're definitely going to bother the neighbors. But B, that we are impacting that FAR, right? By maintaining at least a 20% or 30% based on some of these open space at ground or podium level, we are inherently restricting the FAR.
Yeah, I think you should allow open space wherever it can fit.
Okay, and then bonuses if they can get it up on the roof and maintain privacy setbacks. We're fine with that.
My notes here, I said, let's just say that open space above grade maybe require 50% more, something like that. It's not that expensive to do that kind of stuff. And once you're getting up to that roof, usually you have a lot of space there. We want open space. It makes these units better, more livable, better units. Just increase that percentage so that I don't know, it's just a thought.
So then back to the building height question, then shall we include the height for the stairs or if there is roof access?
What's the current standard for that? The staircase to the,
I'm just trying to think. The staircase typically is included in the measurement of height. The elevator overrun is not.
so we're going to need to change that if we want to use the roof as open space, to have to be able to get up to it.
I think there's a simple solution. It's just adding a caveat that there's an exemption for one staircase access and one elevator access to the height limitation.
I remember discussing this before, and the question really was how close to the edge of the building they could put that. If it's in the center of the building, it just doesn't matter. I think it needs more study to decide how you would regulate that, but I would be in favor of allowing projections into the height limit for access features, provided they were not nominally visible from the ground kind of thing. And I would look to some of these consultants to do some studies. What's the best way to accomplish that? It's not so easy because these staircases are also serving life safety issues where they're at the perimeter of the building.
And
It's not the highest point at the perimeter, it's the lower point of the staircase.
Chair.
Because the run is going outside the building line to the sidewalk, to the whatever access.
A microphone, David.
Oh, sorry, I'll repeat. It's usually the shorter dimension, the height dimension is less at the perimeter. So perhaps you say allowable up to a half a dimension of the staircase height.
Here's another idea though. If you allow those things to project into the height limit, but not the daylight plane, you've used the daylight plane again for what I keep talking about. That protects you from seeing it, from impacting the neighbors.
but then we don't have daylight plan from front, right, street.
Right, but maybe on the front, it's not so important.
No, you wouldn't want a chimney of a staircase projecting 10 feet above at the front. So I do like the concept that the daylight plane, if you continued it off beyond the height limit, you're allowed to, as long as you respect the daylight plane continuance, then you could add a staircase or an elevator. However, I would want some sort of setbacks
But
from those street
it's
sides.
pretty darn unlikely an architect's going to put an elevator or a stair on the front facade.
I mean,
No,
Such
not
a
an
prominent
elevator,
location.
of course, no.
I mean, it would be such an impact on your design in so many other ways that just keeping it
Yes,
simple.
but I also don't discount that we will see one soon enough.
Yeah, just cannot remember the exact the 660 University Avenue. Do they have like the staircase put on the street corner?
There is.
Kind of like a tower
Yes.
elements.
Well, you have elevators actually
Yeah,
at the
right.
perimeter on 660 on University.
Okay, point well taken, yeah. So I think to the staff, we would need to have some exception for access to these rooftop things if we're serious about allowing that for open space.
Chair, may I? I had forgotten that as part of the objective standard changes, and we did also make some changes to the general standards and exceptions under 184230 for rooftop gardens. And then we did allow, just as Chair Balte had mentioned, an allowance for stairs.
Board member Balte,
Oh,
please.
I'm sorry. Thank you. With the exception that it had to be set back from the edges of the building, and it has
Right.
specific exceptions that we put in there. So
Excellent.
it does have that allowance. I apologize.
No, I appreciate that. So if we've already got the objective standards, which we took a lot of time and care to put into place, let's follow those objective standards here as well, I think would be fine. And that those allowances would be exempt from the height limitation.
One more minor thing is shall we just say only limited to staircase and elevators? Because for the projects that we reviewed last time, for our last meeting, it also put the storage space next to the staircase on rooftop.
That's a fair point. Yeah, I
Well,
think the
what's-
intent of the objective standards was staircase and elevator access, that we're not going to allow extra storage. That was never the intention. It was purely for access. Okay.
Did we make a decision about? Ooh, did we make a decision about parking? Have we really done that?
Our summary on parking was 0 spaces for studios, 1 space for other units above that, and that we were going to allow the PTC and planning to come up with a specific number for service units per, or service spaces per unit of habitable space.
I think that's going to be a problem if we don't have anything. I was thinking maybe a half a space per efficiency unit is a better choice.
I hear that. I think my argument for opposing that is that when you have an efficiency space, it's almost equivalent. You know, if you have 2 efficiency spaces, it's basically like the floor square footage that you need for that is basically equivalent to a 1-bedroom, right? So you're sort of keeping it consistent across the board. Whereas if we do want to slightly encourage efficiency spaces by not requiring it at all, you might see a few more efficiency spaces because it is less impactful for parking. And in the same regard, because a 3-bedroom unit doesn't get sort of taxed with a parking space, you might see encouragement of those as well. So the sort of highest tax, of lack of a better way to say it, of parking space per square footage of habitable unit is really the 1-bedroom. So we'll see fewer 1-bedrooms, but much more likely to see efficiencies 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms. Does that make sense? So that's my thinking on it, is that I would like to encourage a little bit more variety. And I think that if you have a half a space per efficiency, it's basically the equivalent of anything else. So we'll end up with a lot of 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom units and not a lot of efficiencies or 1-bedrooms.
Board Member Rosenberg, if I can
Please.
suggest one thing. In a lot of apartment buildings in Oakland or San Francisco, you rent the unit, and then if you want parking, you can rent the parking. And so what you might consider is having a requirement for, say, 1 space per unit, but then allow the building management to dictate the allotment. So perhaps a 2-bedroom gets 2 parking spaces because somebody in a studio chose not to lease a space. That might be a more flexible structure versus saying that, you know, X type of unit has to have X type of space. And I think we'll see more and more with the younger generation driving less, opting out of renting a parking space, but giving them that choice.
No, agreed on that front. I don't think that we're making any sort of stipulations about who needs to be designated these parking spaces. It's purely how many are required to be built based on how much is being built in terms of the housing, right? It's not that a single bedroom is automatically assigned a 1 parking space. I do think that flexibility of management of renting or not renting is completely up to whoever's running the building. It's just when we're asking them to build the parking spaces, it's based on a number here of what we expect to see in terms of intention of renting. But yeah, there might be someone in a 3-bedroom who says, I want to rent 3 parking spaces. We're not dictating that at all. That's completely up to whoever is running and managing the space.
I just think that we have to also be conscious of the marketplace.
Yes.
And the comment I thought was an appropriate one, that it recognizes that, and we're going to run into this. If we don't run into it, the council will run into it for sure.
Correct.
Along the way. So I think that it's a good idea for us to be practical about it, which is why I suggested at least a half for the efficiency is a good idea,
Right.
which gives them a certain amount of flexibility, but not an excessive amount, and reduces the number of cars.
Okay, so it is a reduction from 1 parking space per unit if we allow the efficiencies to be a half a space per unit. And then again, as was brought up, we would have no regulations whatsoever who gets which space. That's up to the management of the building itself.
we don't have that regulation or control now, and
Exactly.
there's no way the planning department can control that.
No, not our intention.
So I would like to see us have a strong unanimous position on this. If we have any chance of it making a difference in the town,
Agree.
we need to speak with one loud voice.
Agree.
So Chair, you decide how you want us to do that, but that's where I stand.
No, I agree with that. And it's, I'm just sort of amenable to trying to reduce it a little bit farther. Whereas I hear what you're saying, Board Member Hirsch, that you're worried that maybe we wouldn't have enough spaces and that for marketability, we would want to have that half a space per studio unit. I guess I'm trying to relax it a little bit more, but if that's something that you feel very strongly about, I could be swayed in that direction. Board Member Chen, did you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Here, what we ask is the minimum. So when the developer felt there's more parking needed for the marketplace, then they can always add, but there is a trade-off.
So what would you be comfortable with?
Just what Yingxi said.
Yeah. So half a space per studio or 0 per studio?
Well, I'm flexible that way too. I mean, I
Okay.
think it could be one, but I think a half space is more restrictive. And if the developer wants to spend the money on it, then they could do that.
Okay. I'm inclined to lean towards 0 spaces required for the studios just because it is less restrictive and would encourage more housing. But again, we would then, it's up to the burden goes on the developer to make sure that that's marketable and feasible for them and who actually wants to rent the spaces. But we as the town are not regulating that to the extent that maybe we have previously and would allow more flexibility. Okay.
So where do we stand?
So I've come back to 0 spaces for studios, 1 space for other units, and then again, the service units number to be decided. And that may be where we get a little bit of that additional parking back without being necessarily super
Can you
restrictive
support that,
for
David? Is
units.
that-
Can you
No, I think a half a space is.
half a space? Okay, so you are pretty firm on that. Okay,
So I support half a space per unit as well.
okay. I'm fine with half a space per unit. Okay,
So that's our recommendation.
okay. So, and I'm gonna summarize all of these at the end. All right, but back to the open space. I do want to make sure that we're speaking with one voice here as well. So on the open space, we've seen percentages for 20%, 30%, 35%. And they sort of flip-flop around between the types of space. And so I guess my question is, do we really want to follow what's being recommended here? Each type has its own system, or do we want to create a more uniform voice on what open space is required?
I'm inclined to stick with the staff recommendations on this. They've obviously studied all this very hard. And what I'd like to have is 2 statements. One is that there is no reduction in the amount of open space required. This is something we think is important. And I don't think there's any of that on this thing from staff, but even more importantly is that open space can be provided anywhere on the property. It's not restricted to ground level. That's really the big change.
I think my hesitation there is that I would say it needs to be ground or podium. But I would be very hesitant to see it all go up on the roof, right? So I would say ground or podium, but beyond that, you could do extra at balconies.
Why do
and
you,
roof
why,
lines.
why couldn't you put it all up on the roof or balconies?
Because I think it is a part of how we restrict floor area. I think that if you're not doing any requirement for open space at ground level or podium level, you are going to see everything built wall to wall, edge to edge, floor to ceiling. And then they're just going to shove all of that open space up on the roof and call it a day.
But if we have landscaping requirements at the perimeter, doesn't that get counted as open space?
But there's
anyway,
no
typically?
setback requirements in some of these as well.
Well, but that's where I want to have a landscape requirement. Even if we don't have a setback requirement, they still have a landscaping requirement. Just make it tough for what we care about, which is the privacy.
Can I ask, where does the objective standards come into all of
Good
this?
question.
I'm just trying to think. So
There's a certain,
typically the landscaping requirements, the landscaped areas are counted toward open space. Once you've met the minimum requirements, then you can also count landscaped areas. I'm just trying to remember the objective standard new changes. I need to look back at the code for a minute, sorry. And I would invite Ms. Iceberg if you have any additional thoughts on this question.
So I will defer to Claire, she's looking that up, but in terms of the rooftops, there's only certain districts right now that allow open space on the roof. And then the objective standards created a series of design standards for those rooftops. I need to double check. I think it's certainly only the commercial districts. I don't believe the rooftop is allowed right now in any of the multifamily zones, for example.
Because I'd be in favor of allowing at least some open space on rooftop type areas in all housing developments, provided they meet our design guidelines for privacy protection.
How would you feel about up to 50% of the open space requirement is allowed on rooftop terraces?
It sounds great in principle. I'd love to have the professionals really just make sure that number, just do a check. Is it the right amount? Is it feasible? Does it matter? But if it does, absolutely, I'd be happy to get that.
Yeah, I guess my concern is I just really would be very hesitant to allow wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling boxes. And I think that having this requirement for open space at ground/podium level forces developers to really make sure that there's some sort of entry that's amenable, there's some sort of
I hear you.
ground
Okay,
space
that's fine.
that's there. And so I'd say a minimum of the 50% of open space would be required at ground or podium level. But I really am very against all of it being up on the roof. I think it's going to be a problem.
So you're saying it's okay to have it at podium level, not
Oh, yeah.
ground level? Though.
Totally fine.
Okay,
Totally fine.
I can buy that, sure.
So, sorry.
Please.
Would you like me to?
Yes.
So looking back at our objective standards, I don't know that we changed anything about the requirements of open space in terms of how much open space as part of the objective standards, but we did put standards in on what was defined as open space, making sure they're large enough, meeting certain dimension requirements. As Board Member Balte mentioned, there were a lot of references to ensure privacy, especially if it was placed in a rooftop setting. But my recollection is that we do allow rooftop. I'm just trying to remember if we do allow rooftops in some of the RM districts, and I was trying to recall because I thought we did have some allowances for that.
I'm also seeing some standards in 18.40.230, which regulates rooftop gardens, including the exemptions on the height limit that Claire referred to earlier. Landscaping requirements at the rooftop, any noise generating equipment, so some performance standards, things like that.
And I think we've heard direction from the board of some interest to allow some of the open space to be on the roof, but concern about privacy and having some of the open space, at least through landscaping on the ground level or podium. And so I think we can look into this more based on that direction. I know the chair was interested in keeping this meeting from going too much longer. So I believe the one other item you had on your list was to touch on if there was anything in regards to retail.
Correct. And thank you again. I'm not trying to rush the meeting. I just want to sort of respect everyone's time. So retail, I think that again is one of those items that our reduction in retail will allow easier development of these properties. So our reduction in retail requirements. However, I'm also a big believer in incentivization. So incentivizing people doing things. So we had discussed very early on in the meeting the potential of adding an extra height if you're going to go retail. I think at this point it's kind of a moot point with us increasing everything by 5 feet anyway. So the question would be, are we comfortable with the reduction in retail requirements that's been proposed? If yes, do we have any ideas for how to maybe incentivize it back as a not requirement, but as something that could be a benefit?
Well, in my notes on this, as we thought about all this, To me, what's important is that the ground floor of these buildings somehow activate the pedestrian way, that they not just be a wall with parking. I think that can be retail, but it can also just be the lobby to the building or the mailroom, or done well, a bicycle storage area. And what I want to see us do is, as I think about it, it just really means no parking. And so if you were to sort of regulate that the use on the ground floor frontage on streets was somehow not parking, you might just get all the way there. Then developers are going to have to make it something with windows, basically. It's awfully tough to regulate or legislate this, because I think just the ground floor retail thing is trying to restructure society as well, trying to put stores where nobody wants to run a business. And that's kind of silly. It just leaves you wide open to ridiculous criticism. What we care about as architects, at least what I care about, is that you somehow activate that frontage, get it so you see that people live there and work there.
I have to admit, every time I think about this, I think actually quite fondly of, there's a dog baby sitting center in Mountain View. And as you drive down the street, it's just these big glass windows and you see all the dogs happily playing through the windows. And I'm like, that's not retail. It's not, you know, it's not a coffee shop, but man, it really makes that street a fun street to drive down. You just see all these dogs happily
So
playing.
activate it for people and pets.
People and pets, right? But having some sort of activation, I think is really important. And then the next question would be, how do we accomplish that, right? Is it just a restriction of dimension? Is it saying there's no parking within the first 12 feet and that they can put a mailroom in 12 feet? They can put a bike storage in 12 feet? Or is it that, I mean, how do we prohibit parking from being adjacently facing the streetscape?
Commercial wants to be on the street frontage, right? So there's a problem there. You know, I've been concerned about the projects along San Antonio, you know, where the council insists that there be a certain amount of commercial. It's set way back from the street, and it's one small store in a building of 50, 60, 70 units. Maybe if they all need something every day, that it would be useful, but the chances are that it might not be useful at all. And that commercial has to be based on population that needs it nearby. And I would wish that there would be a better way for us to determine something like that, not just that we apply it all over El Camino just because it's required. I don't know how to answer that, though. You know, I find that it seems like we have shopping centers. I'm not in love with shopping centers. They become horrible malls most of the time. Parking is disgusting looking. And so they're not great places to go to except get it and go home right away. Small shopping centers are kind of nice to have, I must admit, you know, like Midtown, which we're missing our coffee shop now because it burned down in the building behind it at the same time. They're more useful and more pleasant to go to. Individual buildings, when they're very separate from population or from other commercial generally on a street, don't work at all well.
I totally agree with that. I guess my comment is that I think that the reduction of retail requirements is appropriate, but at the same time, I would be concerned if it was basically parking all the way up to sidewalk space and street facing space. So I'd like this board to figure out a way, whether it's we, you know, punt this back to PTC or council, or whether we come up with an idea that says how we can help prohibit this parking from just being like the edge. We don't want concrete walls on sidewalks. That's the parking's on the other side of that. So activating the streetscape is really the goal. And how they accomplish that could be, like Peter said, with mail rooms or bike rooms or things like that, but maintaining a buffer zone of activated space on streetscape ground floor level.
The complexity is that, I'm sure our consultant would tell us, the moment you regulate how that podium, that parking podium, which is what it is constructed, you really change the economics of the project. And what we're saying is you can't really have a ground floor podium because the front 20 feet of it or so has to be something else. It's really does make the building process much more complicated. You're basically pushing for what he called a wrapped construction
Right.
every time. But I think I would say, yeah, you're right. And yes, we're right. We don't want ground floor podium construction.
Not street facing.
Street facing. I don't want to see
Right.
that in El Camino. I don't want to see that much of anywhere if I can help it.
Right.
So maybe that is the right regulation to say, no parking within 20 feet of frontage or something like that.
And I guess the next question would be, do we have a distance that we would go for? Is the distance actually the requirement that we want to put in place? Or is it that we can just say something as simple as no parking is the immediate forefront of a building at street facing? And let them figure that out. Because if they only need 10 feet for a mailroom, a 10-foot mailroom will absolutely provide the buffer. So I'd be, a little hesitant to say 20 feet if they can get away with, if they can come up with a creative
If
solution.
you have a 75-foot lot and you take out 20 feet, then you're left with 55 and you can't really get a double loaded aisle. You
Exactly.
need 5 more feet. So if you made it
Exactly.
15 feet, then it would work, but
Right.
maybe
But
the
it's
lot's
all
85 feet.
Exactly. So I'd say just keeping that open-ended regulation of saying there must be a buffer of some type of activated space between parking and streetscape.
Probably
period.
the best we can do is let planning staff know that our concern is that you somehow activate that frontage with
Yes.
something other than parking. But how you write that regulation, I don't know.
Right.
And they do this. We
Yeah,
don't.
exactly. And if it's a corner lot, I'm actually also less concerned on the corner side versus the front side, right? So the longer side could be activated and the short side, maybe actually it does go all the way out to the edge.
Yeah. But we should be conscious of the fact that this is a distinct negative for builders.
Right.
And so we want staff to hear from us that we're aware of that. But this is something we think is pretty important. Come back to David's example of New York City or even San Francisco. Every major commercial boulevard, like El Camino might be one day, is important because it doesn't have parking on the front. It has
Right.
commercial activity. I don't know if that was regulated that way, but as you go down Broadway in New York City, there's shop after shop after shop until you turn the corner and it's residential. Then it's house after house or apartment after apartment. Seems to be a good way to do planning. And if we set ourselves up for that by not allowing too much buildings on major streets that cannot in the future develop that way, that's good. And I think as architects, that's really all we can do is just point out the importance of having ground floor activated spaces on commercial areas.
David, final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm stuck up still on podiums. I just don't think a podium should face a street and that it is.
I think we're in agreement with that.
Okay.
I think the board is pretty much unanimous in that. I mean,
Okay.
yeah. So it's just, we don't necessarily have the tools or language at the current moment to regulate exactly how it should be done. But again, that's why we have this
No podiums.
highly educated staff that can assist with that. So.
And a podium isn't necessarily just parking. I mean, a podium can have residential units, it can have retail, it can have the mailroom. It's just simply type 1 construction. And so I think it's important. I appreciate the flexibility on the side streets. I think that's really important, and the importance of activating the ground level. But I'd be careful to mix the word podium with parking, because
Appreciated, yeah.
Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
No, appreciate the semantic clarification there, because you're right. Our concern is not the podium itself. It's the concern is with the activated or unactivated spaces. We wouldn't want a, concrete wall with nothing behind it to be fronting the entire length of this. So maybe there's a 50% can be concrete, something like that. So again, it's a bit more nuanced than maybe we're prepared to tackle at this current moment. But I think the goal is that we have activated sidewalk spaces.
Can I throw out
Please?
As I went through all this, I made a note about 2 things I wanted to bring to staff's attention. If you want to encourage underground parking, or at least try to reduce the cost of it and the complexity, in my work, I've found that there's 2 requirements that are very much engineering related, which are really a factor. One is how we design the ramps that go down into these spaces. What seems to frequently happen is that this gets into the hands of the engineering department, and they want a double width ramp with certain transition curves at the top and the bottom, which lengthen the ramp to over 100 feet. And the reality is that people could do with a very narrow one-way ramp with a light at the top and the bottom. And most cars could handle much tighter transition curves. We're looking at this sort of what's in the AASHTO handbook from 1955. And to make basements easier to build, more affordable, make the ramps steeper. And we might get basements out of it if we did that. The second thing, and just pointing out to Palo Alto, we have extremely difficult dewatering requirements, which make it very hard to build below ground. And there's a big argument for why we have those, but we should be conscious of the fact that because of those, we're making below grade construction really challenging. And we pay the price for that when we now have to deal with parking at grade. Many of the things we're talking about today would be much less difficult if we just had parking below ground.
100% agree with that.
So those two things, it might be worth, if you guys have the bandwidth, to push to the engineering department. What could you do with ramp standards, and what could we do about dewatering to incentivize basement construction?
Right, and especially some of this dewatering, I have personal experience with this in Palo Alto. The dewatering standards and regulations, I think, are dramatically different if you have a habitable home versus if it's an underground parking garage, right? Those should be treated differently in a way that I don't think they are. It's anything underground has to go with these very strict rules and regulations, when habitable versus uninhabitable should absolutely have a factor in here. So
I think we're trying to wind up with those things which we are personally most bothered by.
yes.
So I'm going to have mine then. What we're getting on San Antonio Road are these very shallow side yards, so that buildings are almost 8 to 10 feet from each other. Here we're talking about privacy, and you have windows straight at windows inside yards. How do we, I mean, we're talking about landscape possibilities, setbacks that could take landscaping. Why are we letting these buildings be so close to each other? Large buildings with big, wonderful courtyards in which all those perimeter units don't look on that courtyard. Is this appropriate? Are these forms appropriate? Why haven't we objected to them?
I mean, I think that's one of the things that the developers are going to have to deal with when they have zero setback limitations, is if they put a perimeter, set of apartments that face outward, and their next door neighbor is also allowed to build a 6-story tall, zero setback building, right? That's gonna.
Isn't that precisely why we put those daylight plane guardrails in?
Correct.
Above 25 feet, you just can't do that.
Yep.
That was our fair compromise.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yep.
Beyond 25 feet, you're not going to have units next to each other, no matter what the setbacks are.
Right. Okay, at this point, I think, any final comments, Ying-Chi?
You're not
No.
going to have it except at the ground floor up to 16 feet? Is that what you're saying?
25 feet was our.
25 feet to the daylight plane.
Yeah.
So it's two stories.
Yeah, all else being equal, you can't have more than 2 stories of residential above it.
So you're going to get 2 stories with residential that's facing each other 10 feet apart.
Possibly, yeah.
Mhm.
But that's the compromise, David,
Yeah.
between trying to encourage building and still get some better humane living situations.
Yeah,
That's compared to the 10-foot setback we had as a blanket residential setback
right.
in the CC zone, for example.
I believe Board Member Chen has a couple final questions, and then I'd like to summarize our thoughts for the staff.
Yeah, so we discussed a lot about the details. I want to have a question to the staff about the timeline, the permit process between the HIP and the state density bonuses plan. Do you have like a side-by-side comparison, like how long it will take and overall the estimated timeline for each of them?
I believe that it looks like Jean has unmuted. Did you want to take a first response to this question?
Sure, I can speak to it sort of from the objective standpoint, not maybe in practice, but there are no prescribed timelines for the housing incentive program, and there are no prescribed timelines for the state density bonus law. So unlike, an SB 35 or a 30-day, there's still a 30-day completeness review for both projects. In terms of process, the way the housing incentive program was originally devised, there was a requirement for architectural review, which meant up to 3 hearings with the ARB. Since the adoption of the HIP, now we have the objective design standards and we have that streamlined review process. So now, and the housing element is clear about this, now a project that is requesting the HIP can also be eligible for the streamlined review if it's meeting if the project is meeting the objective standards. So that means only 1 study session with the ARB. So today, if someone is asking for the HIP standards versus asking for state density bonus law, and they're meeting objective standards, it would be 1 meeting with the ARB. So that's sort of the big picture process. In terms of staff's processing times, they might have other feedback for you.
Okay, thank you. And one more question about the map. So I saw the map on packet page 67. So there are existing and proposed. And I'm curious about the proposed area. For example, the ones along San Antonio's. I think the proposed one also include properties like JCC, which is a newer developed site. So I want to know what the proposed area mean in this case.
So the housing element program 3.4 is specific about how this extends, but you're right, it is essentially a blanket. So it's right now it only applies in certain commercial districts and is proposed to be added to the GMROLM focus area. That's the purples areas on the eastern side of the city, all of the housing inventory sites. So this certainly could capture both with the existing parcels that are eligible and proposed parcels, could capture sites that have been recently redeveloped or that we wouldn't expect to develop as housing even. So it's not intended to suggest that, a housing development project might happen there.
Gotcha, thank you.
Okay, thank you for those questions. At this time, I'd like to try and summarize for the staff the final thoughts of the ARB. I'm going to go through this one by one, and I'd like you to please let me know if there's an objection to something that I'm saying or a misunderstanding. But I'm going to try and summarize the board's comprehensive thoughts here. So number 1 on FAR, we seem all to be in favor, hesitantly so, but in favor of eliminating a maximum FAR. And we would like to rely on daylight planes, setbacks, and height limits to really determine the floor areas that can be done. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, height and daylight planes. We all seem to be comfortable with the municipal code standard of 25 feet at a 45-degree angle for the majority of properties. However, if the property is adjacent to an R1 residential, a low 2-story, building, any of the residential units, that limit should be restricted to a 16-foot height limit at 45 degrees per the packet recommendation. We would also like to include an additional 5-foot height bonus across the board to what's being shown in the packet to account for parapet walls and grade changes. That 5-foot height limit should be the maximum height, including parapet walls. Number 3, was there anything else on height and daylight planes? I think that pretty much covered it. Oh, thank you. Exactly, but I would like to, formally touch base on that the elevators and rooftop elevators and staircases should be exempt from the height restriction per the objective standards codes that we have previously reviewed and approved.
Thank you. And one question of
Please.
Clarification on the height. You mentioned the lower daylight plane when adjacent to R1 residential. I wanted to clarify whether you wanted to restrict that just to the R1 or any of the low-density residential
I believe we.
areas?
Thank you for correcting my comment there. Yes, we would like it to be next to any of the low-density residential neighborhoods. So not just the R1. Thank you. All right, number 3 would be parking. At this time, it seems that the board is amenable to a half a space required per studio/efficiency apartment, 1 space required for all other units, whether they be 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, etc. We would also like to request that PTC and staff review an appropriate ratio number for requirement of service parking spaces per units in a building. We think that the 1-to-3 ratio from the townhouse study was too restrictive. So we'd like to see something higher than that. The number that I had thrown out was 1-to-20 units, 1 parking space per 20 units. That may be too loose. So we would like to see an appropriate number presented by staff and PTC.
Chair, is it possible to ask staff to, with that recommendation on parking, make a clear statement that we're recommending that based on the impact on the building design and construction, not based on any need for parking or not need for parking? I'd like
That's appropriate.
I'd like
Yeah.
not to have the PTC or council think we're overstepping our bounds. We think this is important from an architectural design perspective.
Yes, I appreciate that.
That's why we're saying this.
Thank you. In addition, I'd also like to lump into the parking conversation. We'd like to see setback limits for parking from streetscape to maintain an activated sidewalk space and streetscape. We are going to leave that somewhat ambiguous and open-ended because we do not have firm size requirements or percentage lengths or things like that at this time. But we do want to make sure that the primary streetscape stays activated. Number 4, open space requirements. We seem very amenable to the percentages that were requested for each of the zoning types. Those seemed appropriate. There was conversation about whether that needed to be at ground level or podium level. That seemed to be amenable either or. There was conversation about getting some up onto rooftop terraces. I think I'm probably the stick in the mud here, and that I would like to see at least 50% at ground/podium level, and beyond that could be more open for interpretation. I think everyone seemed to be okay with that. I'm looking at David here. He's got a furrow on his brow. Microphone.
Back on the guest parking spaces, I thought it should really be 1 and 10, not 20.
No, and I'm not requesting 1-to-20. I'm saying that somewhere between 1 and 3 and 1-to-20 is likely where we will end up, but we are going to leave that up to staff and PTC.
Okay, or maybe to go with a recommendation of a specific number of 1 to 10 minimum, something like that.
I'm not comfortable making that judgment call right at the moment. That's the hard part.
Reason I say that, a little bit of history here. We had a project that was very far from streets, and guest parking was a significant issue there. So the parking, which would be for service, is one thing, but for guests is something else. And I think you need to have a certain amount for guests.
And I appreciate that clarification. Let me restate what I said. That service parking that I'm speaking of should be service, guests, Amazon pickup drop-offs, but yes, also including guest parking. So again, I definitely appreciate that clarification that number may need to be higher, maybe need to be closer to 1 to 10 because it is supposed to include guest parking. Yes.
Yes, fine.
Thank you.
Add that.
Appreciate that.
Okay. Now let's see, where are we at with it?
All right, so open space, so no reduction beyond what was here. Rooftop terraces, we seem very amenable to, and specifically in following sort of the previously stated objective standards that we had reviewed for that. Maintaining specifically, we want to make sure that we've got privacy standards, especially when next to low residential units. So whether it's the setbacks, as discussed previously from those edges, we want to make sure that the residents really maintain their standard of living while we're still providing as much housing as possible. Finally, point number 5 would be retail. And along that, we are comfortable reducing any of the requirements per the packets of the retail requirements. On that note, however, going back to the parking, we want to make sure that the streetscape stays activated. Whatever capacity that is, we do leave that up to developer and to city staff, but we want to make sure that there's activation at sidewalk level.
Could we clarify, please?
Please.
In the staff report on page 35, they're recommending a decrease in landscaping coverage and requirements. And I want to be clear that, at least I think we are not supporting that. Their objective standards has clear landscaping requirements for privacy, and I do not support changing that.
Agreed. I feel like we didn't maybe discuss landscaping during this meeting as much as maybe we should have. I sort of took for granted that we were all sort of in agreement with what we have previously discussed and approved in objective standards, and we'd like to maintain that. This would tie into point number 4, open space. So there might need to be a quick discussion here on this. Do we all feel comfortable supporting Peter's comment that we want to maintain the objective standards for minimum landscape requirements and privacy?
Where is it?
What's the one about?
What are we talking about? On the ground landscaping?
Was ground level trees at property lines adjacent to private other parties.
Yes, I mean, I just don't think that we should overdo that because it's a great opportunity here for greater density to increase the footprint of a building as in many situations.
I would say I think that the concern is primarily when it's next to a low density residential property.
Yes, I agree there.
Yeah.
But I'm concerned about limiting the possibility of denser development. I think if we push towards greater amount of open space, we're going to limit the potential for maxing out on number of
I
units.
believe our objective standards requires landscaping for privacy under certain situations. And I'm trying to point out, I do not think we should relax those standards.
It's going to be hard in certain zones to do this.
We'd have to see what the standard actually says, I suppose.
Yeah, so we might need to put a pin in this one specific point, gather more information on it. Now, I understand that this is basically, we are providing recommendations to PTC at this time. This is not scheduled to come back to us again. However, I'm going to ask that staff provides a follow-up after the next PTC hearing, and I'm happy to sit in on that meeting as well and bring that back to the board. But I would like to know what happens next here because we are providing recommendations, but there's no vote. There's nothing in terms of concise action at this time beyond this discussion and providing our input to the PTC.
Good point.
So we'd like to see where that falls. So when the next PTC happens, I would request if the staff would kindly let me know. I'll sit in on that and then we can bring it back to the board and just have a follow-up.
We will do that.
Thank you so much. Any final thoughts on this one? Okay, I think we were pretty loud and clear about what we liked, what we didn't like. Landscaping is definitely always a benefit and privacy for sure. At this time, we're going to close this item, move on to our last item, which is approval of minutes on the agenda. So I did have one small, very small item. So I'd like to, unless there's any other comments, but on packet page, where is it? Packet page 78, Chair Rosenberg observed paint would be the best to provide the transition between the tiles. I think that's supposed to be paint. I don't need anyone to have pain induced on them. So it's a small item. I would like that correct.
I'm not sure that's what I remember you saying.
And also one minor thing on
Please.
packet page 76, Vice Chair Chen mentioned. So she wanted to know if the gross floor area, not grass,
Oh.
GROSS.
Gross floor area,
Yeah.
not
gross.
grass floor area.
Sorry, which page was that?
Packet page 76,
How did I miss that one?
paragraph 5, the fifth paragraph, Vice Chair Chen mentioned.
Oh, yep.
She wanted to know if the gross.
If the
instead of-
grass floor area will be reduced, that should be gross, GROSS. Again, sorry, these are minor. We can approve the minutes as long as these things get updated. We just want to make sure that the intent is correct. So not to be nitpicky. On that note, I will move to approve the minutes as written with those 2 minor adjustments.
Second,
Thank you, David. Can we call for a vote, please?
Board Member Bolte,
Yes.
Board Member Hirsch,
yes,
Vice Chair Chen,
Yes,
Chair Rosenberg.
Yes.
Motion carries 4-0.
Perfect. Board member questions, comments, announcements, future meetings and agendas? I don't believe we have anything at the moment. All right. Nice to see you both in chambers today. Claire, great job. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you guys so much.